The rats existed for less than a year, 7 young lives bound by contempt for a world that had marked them disposable. Their story unfolded across the war-ravaged provinces of Nilfgaard's occupation, where the collapse of social order created spaces for those willing to embrace violence as philosophy and survival as their only moral framework. This chronicle traces their formation, their descent, and their destruction, examining how trauma transforms into cruelty, how belonging can be purchased through participation in darkness, and how confidence born from limited success blinds the young to threats that operate beyond their comprehension. What follows is the complete account of the gang called the Rats, whose notoriety across Geso province concluded in minutes of professional violence that demonstrated the distance between reputation and reality. Before we continue through this examination of the Rats and their place in the time of contempt, I would be honored if you would like this video and consider subscribing, but only if you genuinely appreciate our content. I would also love to know where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is for you. Let me know in the comments. The Nilfgaardian Wars swept across the northern kingdoms with a violence that dissolved the foundations of civil order. Borders that had stood for generations collapsed under the weight of advancing legions, and the territories claimed by Emhyr var Emreis became testing grounds for new forms of administration, new systems of control, and new hierarchies of suffering. The impact of this conquest extended far beyond the reordering of maps and the installation of puppet governors. Entire populations found themselves uprooted, their villages transformed into staging grounds for military operations, their farms requisitioned to feed armies whose allegiance they had never sought. The war created a class of the displaced, individuals stripped of context and community, wandering roads that had become arteries of violence rather than commerce. The Tanned coup served as a focal point for the fracturing of the old order. What had been presented as a gathering of magical intellect transformed into a massacre of alliances, a purging of moderate voices, and the beginning of a paranoia that would infect the northern courts for years to come. The coup did more than reorganize the Brotherhood of Sorcerers. It shattered the illusion that intellect and power could insulate anyone from the chaos spreading across the continent. Mags who had believed themselves above the concerns of common soldiers found themselves hunted, their towers stormed, their apprentices conscripted or executed depending on the whims of newly empowered military commanders. The collapse of this institutional stability sent ripples through every layer of society, removing the cushions of patronage and protection that had allowed certain forms of scholarship, certain forms of artistry, certain forms of peaceful existence to flourish in the margins of a violent world. Banditry emerged as both a symptom and a consequence of this systemic disintegration. Roads that had once been patrolled by local militias now fell silent except for the movements of deserters, refugees, and opportunists. The collapse of trade routes meant the collapse of the economic structures that had sustained towns and villages, creating vacuums that armed groups filled with varying degrees of organization and intent. Some bandits operated as remnants of shattered military units, maintaining a quasi-disciplined approach to their predation. Others formed around charismatic individuals who offered the only commodity that mattered in the chaos: belonging. The emergence of young gangs, known colloquially as Hansas, represented a particular phenomenon within this broader landscape of violence. These were groups formed predominantly from deserters barely old enough to have completed their first campaigns, orphans created by the same armies they had once served, and displaced youth who had watched their homes burn and concluded that survival required the abandonment of every moral framework they had been taught. The Hansas differed from traditional bandit companies in their composition and their psychology. Where older criminal enterprises often maintained hierarchies borrowed from military structures or merchant guilds, the young gangs operated on bonds of shared trauma and mutual recognition. They were children of contempt, raised in a world that had demonstrated its utter disregard for their lives, their futures, and their humanity. This contempt bred a particular form of ruthlessness, one untempered by the pragmatic considerations that might have restrained more experienced criminals. The Hansas killed for entertainment as readily as for profit, distributed stolen goods to win the protection of peasant communities, and displayed a theatrical cruelty that served both psychological and strategic purposes. They were performers of violence in a landscape where violence had become the primary language of power, and their youth made them both more vulnerable and more dangerous than the hardened mercenaries who had preceded them. The province of Geso lay southward of the Amel Mountains, a territory that had fallen under Nilfgaardian administration during the earliest waves of the northern campaigns. Its geography marked it as a border region, a place where the certainties of imperial control gradually dissolved into the ambiguities of contested frontier. The land itself bore the characteristics of transition: rolling hills that gave way to flatter agricultural plains, forests that thickened as one moved away from the established trade routes, and rivers that served as both arteries of commerce and natural boundaries between zones of influence. Geso had been absorbed into the empire through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering. Its local nobility offered the choice between cooperation and obliteration. Most had chosen cooperation, accepting Nilfgaardian titles and administrative positions in exchange for the preservation of their estates and the lives of their families. The town of Amarillo served as the administrative center of Geso, housing the prefecture that represented imperial authority in the region. The prefecture system imposed by Nilfgaard operated on principles of centralized control tempered by pragmatic flexibility. Prefects were appointed from among loyal imperial servants, men who had demonstrated both competence and ideological commitment to the vision of a unified continent under Nilfgaardian rule. Their responsibilities encompassed tax collection, the maintenance of order, the adjudication of disputes, and the supervision of local military forces. In practice, the extent of their authority varied dramatically depending on distance from major garrisons and the strength of local resistance. In Amarillo itself, the prefect maintained a visible presence, his edicts posted in the town square, his guards patrolling the market districts, his court hearing cases that ranged from property disputes to accusations of sedition. The social conditions within occupied Geso created an environment where criminal enterprises could take root and flourish. The imposition of Nilfgaardian taxation systems disrupted traditional economic relationships, extracting wealth from communities already impoverished by the passage of armies and the redirection of trade routes. Resentment toward the occupation simmered beneath the surface of daily life, expressing itself in passive resistance, black market trading, and the selective enforcement of imperial law. The prefectural authorities found themselves in a paradoxical position, too weak to fully suppress criminal activity, yet dependent on maintaining the appearance of control to justify their positions within the imperial hierarchy. This created spaces where outlaws could operate with relative impunity, particularly in the rural areas between towns where the reach of the prefecture dissolved into rumor and occasional punitive expeditions. The festival culture that persisted in Geso despite the occupation represented a form of cultural continuity, assertion that local identity could survive the imposition of foreign rule. The Festival of the Harvest, celebrated in Amarillo and the surrounding villages, drew crowds from across the province. Merchants set up stalls selling goods both legal and contraband. Performers offered entertainments that ranged from traditional music to displays of sword skill, and the prefectural authorities maintained a calculated tolerance for activities that would have been suppressed under other circumstances. The festivals served multiple functions within the social ecology of occupied Geso. They provided economic opportunities for a population struggling under imperial taxation, they offered moments of release from the grinding pressures of daily survival, and they created neutral spaces where individuals from different backgrounds could interact without the immediate oversight of authority. These festivals also served as gathering points for those who existed outside or in opposition to the established order. Deserters moved through the crowds wearing civilian clothing, seeking news of amnesty offers or the movements of bounty hunters. Orphans worked as pickpockets and message runners, their small size and anonymity making them valuable assets to criminal networks. Displaced youth congregated in the less reputable sections of the fairgrounds, sharing stories of survival and forming the bonds that would crystallize into more permanent associations. The marketplaces became theaters where status could be performed and negotiated, where reputations could be established through displays of wealth or violence, and where the careful observer could identify individuals whose ambitions extended beyond mere survival. It was in these spaces, amid the chaos of celebration and commerce, that the foundations of the rats would be laid, 6 individuals drawn together by circumstances that transformed strangers into accomplices and accomplices into something approaching family. Giselher had been a deserter before he became a founder. The specifics of which army he abandoned remained obscured by his own silence on the matter, a deliberate vagueness that suggested shame, pragmatism, or simply the recognition that past allegiances meant nothing in a world where survival depended on the bonds formed in the present rather than loyalties sworn in the past. What remained clear was that desertion had been a common choice during the middle years of the Nilfgaardian campaigns, when the initial fervor of defense had curdled into exhaustion and the realization that the war would consume generations rather than seasons. Young men who had enlisted believing in glory or duty found themselves instead witnessing the systematic destruction of everything they had been told they were protecting. Desertion became a rational response to an irrational situation, and those who fled the formations did so with the understanding that survival required reinvention. Giselher had joined a gang after his desertion, one of the many small bands that moved through the contested territories preying on refugees and isolated farmsteads. The composition of this group remained unknown, their names unrecorded, their fates serving as cautionary examples rather than memorable tragedies. They had made the mistake of venturing into territory claimed by free elves, those communities of Shade who had refused integration into human kingdoms and maintained their ancestral holdings through a combination of geographic advantage and ruthless defense of their borders. The relationship between humans and elves had been poisoned by centuries of mutual violence, and the war had only intensified the hostilities. Elven communities viewed human deserters as invaders regardless of their status as outcasts from human society, and the response to incursions into elven territory was typically immediate and final. The massacre that destroyed Giselher's original gang followed patterns established through generations of border warfare. The elves struck at dawn, emerging from positions they had held throughout the night, their arrows finding targets before the bandits had fully registered the attack. The violence was efficient rather than theatrical, designed to eliminate threats and discourage future incursions rather than to send elaborate messages. Giselher survived through a combination of positioning and fortune, finding himself pinned to a tree by an elven arrow that passed through his shoulder and embedded itself in the wood behind him. The wound was severe, the pain immediate and overwhelming, yet the arrow's placement meant he remained conscious while his companions fell around him. He hung there as the elves moved through the camp, their work methodical and unhurried, ensuring that no one would carry word of the encounter back to other human bands. The night that followed represented a threshold between identities, a space where Giselher existed suspended between his past and whatever future might emerge from his survival. The pain in his shoulder became a constant companion, sharpening whenever he attempted to move, reminding him that the arrow held him in place as effectively as any chain. He listened to the sounds of the forest, the movements of scavengers drawn to the scene, the rustling that might have been wind or might have been elves returning to confirm their work. Delirium came and went, bringing with it visions that mixed memory and hallucination, faces of the fallen superimposed over images from childhood, from the army he had deserted, from moments he could not be certain had ever actually occurred. Dawn arrived without certainty that he would see it, and with it came a figure moving through the morning mist. Iskra approached the tree where Giselher hung with the caution of someone accustomed to violence presenting itself in unexpected forms. She was a half-elf, her heritage visible in the delicate structure of her features, the slight point to her ears, the particular quality of her movements that suggested an ease in wild spaces that full-blooded humans rarely achieved. Her presence in the aftermath of the massacre carried implications about her relationship to the elven community that had conducted it, yet her actions suggested a distance from their certainties. She examined Giselher with an expression that revealed neither pity nor cruelty, assessing whether he represented a threat worth finishing or an opportunity worth preserving. The decision she made in that moment would reshape both their futures, creating a debt that would bind them together and eventually draw 4 others into an association that would become known across the northern provinces. She freed him from the arrow, the pain of extraction nearly causing him to lose consciousness, and in doing so transformed a dying deserter into the foundation upon which the rats would be built. The festival of the harvest in Amarillo drew crowds that transformed the town beyond recognition, swelling its population with merchants, performers, gamblers, and those whose professions defied easy categorization. The festival occupied a liminal space in the calendar of occupied Geso, a moment when the usual strictures of prefectural authority relaxed enough to allow behaviors that would have prompted arrests during ordinary times. Stalls lined the streets selling roasted meats, fermented beverages, and goods whose provenance no one questioned too closely. Musicians competed for attention and coin, their songs ranging from traditional harvest hymns to ballads celebrating outlaws and rebels. Gambling rings operated in semi-public spaces, their organizers paying appropriate bribes to ensure that prefectural guards looked elsewhere. It was in this environment of controlled chaos that 6 individuals would encounter one another and recognize something that transcended the immediate transactions of festival commerce. Giselher moved through the crowds with the wariness of someone who had learned that survival required constant assessment of threats and opportunities. His appearance marked him as someone shaped by violence, grim in expression, black-haired, lanky in the manner of those who had grown quickly during years of inadequate nutrition. The wound in his shoulder had healed badly, leaving him with limited mobility in his right arm and a constant reminder of the debt he owed to Iskra. He watched the festival with eyes that calculated rather than celebrated, identifying exits from the main square, noting which guards appeared competent and which merely wore uniforms, observing the flow of coin and the patterns of attention that might be exploited. Kayleigh caught his attention through the intensity of his presence, a thin young man with long hair and eyes that carried malevolence as their default expression. The hateful grimace that seemed permanently etched across his features suggested experiences that had calcified into something harder than mere bitterness. When their gazes met across the crowd, the recognition was immediate and mutual. Here was someone who understood that the world deserved contempt and that survival meant embracing rather than resisting that truth. Reef presented a different profile, his height making him visible even in the densest sections of the crowd. His Nilfgaardian accent marked him as either a deserter from the imperial forces or someone raised in the conquered territories who had learned the conqueror's language. The accent carried implications about loyalty and identity, raising questions about whether he had fled from military service or from the obligations imposed by imperial citizenship. His presence among the festival crowd suggested that whatever his origin, he had concluded that his future lay outside the structures of legitimate society. Mistle stood out through a combination of physical presence and deliberate presentation. Tall and long-legged, she moved with an assurance that contradicted the vulnerability her youth might have suggested. Her hair had been cropped short, straw-colored and bristling like a brush, a style that rejected conventional femininity and signaled membership in communities that operated according to different aesthetic and social codes. The way she carried herself indicated experience with violence, a readiness to respond to threats that came from hard-won understanding rather than theoretical training. Iskra brought an otherworldly quality to the gathering, her half-elven heritage manifesting in features that seemed designed for a different world than the one she inhabited. Big-eyed and dressed in colors that caught light and attention, she moved through the festival with the grace of a dancer and the alertness of a fighter. Her narrow lips and small elven teeth became visible when she smiled, an expression that could shift from genuine warmth to predatory anticipation depending on context. She remained close to Giselher, their bond forged in the moment she had freed him from the arrow, establishing a connection that would deepen into romance and partnership. Asse completed the initial gathering, his broad shoulders and physical presence marking him as someone accustomed to using strength to solve problems. The fair curly down on his chin suggested youth struggling toward maturity, a body that had developed faster than the wisdom that might have tempered its application. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had won enough fights to believe in his own invincibility, a dangerous certainty that would shape his role within the group that was beginning to coalesce around shared recognition. The formation of their bond occurred through processes that were simultaneously spontaneous and inevitable. Conversations begun in taverns extended into shared meals. Shared meals evolved into collaborative efforts at theft or intimidation, and collaborative efforts revealed complementary skills and compatible philosophies. They discovered that they operated according to similar moral frameworks, or more precisely, according to similar absences of the moral frameworks that governed legitimate society. The unofficial hierarchy that emerged placed Giselher at its apex, his survival of the Elven massacre lending him a credibility that the others recognized and accepted. His charisma manifested through understatement rather than bombast, through the ability to articulate plans that balanced risk and reward, and through a cunning that allowed him to anticipate the responses of both victims and authorities. The six had found in each other something approaching family, a constellation of damaged individuals whose collective strength exceeded their individual capabilities and whose shared contempt for the world provided the foundation for an enterprise that would become legendary across the Northern Territories. The name they chose for themselves carried layers of meaning that resonated through the culture of the occupied territories. Ciri meant rats in the Elder speech as filtered through common vernacular, a term that acknowledged both how society viewed them and how they viewed society. Rats were survivors, creatures that thrived in the spaces between human order and natural chaos, that fed on the detritus of civilization and multiplied in environments that would destroy more delicate organisms. The name rejected any pretension to nobility or righteousness, embracing instead an identity as parasites and scavengers, as creatures whose survival depended on exploiting the weaknesses and waste products of larger systems. There was a deliberate inversion of values in this self-identification, a refusal to apologize for existence or to seek redemption through adherence to moral frameworks that had demonstrably failed to protect anyone during the years of war. The philosophical foundation of the rats found expression in a phrase that circulated among those who knew of them. In times of contempt, anyone who is alone must perish. This observation captured the essential logic that had drawn the six together and that would govern their operations throughout their existence as a cohesive unit. The time of contempt had demonstrated that individual virtue, individual strength, and individual intelligence meant nothing when confronted with systematic violence backed by institutional power. The war had ground down heroes and cowards with equal efficiency, making no distinction between the deserving and the undeserving in its distribution of suffering. The only reliable path to survival lay in forming bonds strong enough to create mutual protection, in building structures of loyalty that could resist the forces constantly working to isolate and destroy. The rats understood themselves as a response to this truth, an organism created through the fusion of separate vulnerabilities into a collective strength that could extract resources and defend territory in a landscape where both were constantly contested. Their operational methods reflected this philosophy translated into practice. Robbery served as their primary source of income, targeting merchants, minor nobility, and anyone who displayed wealth in ways that suggested vulnerability. They operated with a violence that exceeded practical necessity, using cruelty as both psychological warfare and entertainment. The violence served multiple functions within their economy of survival. It discouraged resistance from potential victims, it established their reputation as individuals not to be trifled with, and it provided outlets for the rage and trauma that each member carried. The rats moved through occupied Geso like a seasonal storm, appearing in towns and villages, extracting what they needed or wanted, and disappearing before prefectural authorities could organize effective responses. Their youth worked to their advantage in these operations, allowing them to be underestimated by those who expected criminals to display the calculated professionalism of experienced outlaws rather than the chaotic energy of damaged children performing adulthood through violence. A persistent misconception surrounded the rats, a tendency among some observers to reimagine them as figures of romantic rebellion, as champions of the oppressed who redistributed wealth from corrupt elites to suffering peasants. This narrative bore no resemblance to reality. The rats stole for themselves, spending their gains on immediate gratifications rather than pursuing any broader social project. They displayed no particular preference for wealthy targets over poor ones, no systematic ideology that might have justified their actions as resistance rather than simple predation. Occasions when they distributed goods to peasant communities occurred as strategic calculations rather than expressions of solidarity, purchasing goodwill that translated into warnings about approaching authorities or temporary shelter during periods when visibility needed to be minimized. The attempt to reframe the rats as noble outlaws revealed more about the observers making such claims than about the actual practices of the gang, a projection of desired meanings onto individuals who had explicitly rejected the moral categories that might have made such interpretations coherent. The territory where the rats operated most consistently centered on the province of Geso, the region where they had formed and where they maintained networks of informants and safe houses. Geso provided advantages that other territories could not match: a complex geography that offered multiple escape routes, a population sufficiently resentful of Nilfgaardian occupation to view local criminals with some degree of tolerance, and a prefectural administration stretched thin enough that rural areas received minimal supervision. The rats understood the rhythms of this landscape, knew which roads would be traveled by merchants and which by military patrols, recognized which towns could be entered openly and which required nighttime approaches. Their familiarity with Geso transformed geography into advantage, allowing them to operate with an efficiency that would have been impossible in unfamiliar territory. They became a fixture of the region's criminal ecology, a known quantity whose presence shaped the calculations of legitimate authorities and rival outlaw bands alike, a group whose reputation grew with each successful operation and whose philosophy of collective survival through mutual contempt would soon attract an unexpected seventh member. The portal that swallowed Ciri during the chaos at Taned represented a rupture in her existence more profound than mere geographic displacement. The coup had transformed a gathering of magical intellects into a battlefield, and in the desperate moments when violence consumed the island, Ciri's elder blood had activated in response to mortal danger. The power that flowed through her veins carried capabilities that exceeded the understanding of even the most accomplished mags, allowing her to tear holes in the fabric of reality and step through into spaces that should have remained forever separate. The portal deposited her in the Karath Desert, a wasteland that stretched between the heartlands of Nilfgaard and the distant territories of Zerrikania. The transition from the structured environment of Taned to the absolute desolation of Karath would have been disorienting under ideal circumstances, and Ciri's circumstances were far from ideal. The Karath Desert existed in the collective consciousness of the continent as a space of legend rather than geography, a place referenced in ancient texts and travelers' tales but rarely visited by those with the option of avoiding it. The desert earned its fearsome reputation through a combination of environmental hostility and supernatural association. Temperatures during the day reached levels that could incapacitate unprotected humans within hours, while nights brought cold that could prove equally fatal to those without shelter. Water existed only in scattered oases whose locations shifted with the movement of underground streams, creating a landscape where survival depended on knowledge that few possessed and fewer still survived to share. Beneath the sands, according to legends preserved in Zerrikanian oral tradition, lay the ruins of a necropolis, an ancient city whose inhabitants had perished in circumstances that remained obscured by time and the accumulation of desert over their monuments. The necropolis allegedly contained treasures and knowledge from civilizations that had preceded the current arrangement of continent politics, yet the practical difficulties of excavation and the supernatural dangers attributed to disturbing the dead ensured that these remained theoretical rather than actual attractions. Ciri's arrival in Karath occurred in the company of a unicorn, a creature whose presence indicated the intersection of multiple layers of reality, and whose injury suggested that the violence at Taned had claimed victims across species and dimensions. The unicorn represented a connection to powers and intelligences that operated according to logics alien to human comprehension, beings that monitored the movements of elder blood carriers and occasionally intervened in ways that shaped destinies without regard for individual consent. The creature's injury placed Ciri in a position of desperate responsibility, needing to provide aid while lacking the knowledge or resources to do so effectively. Her attempts to draw magic from the flames of a small fire represented both innovation and desperation, an instinctive reaching for power without the training that might have made such efforts safe or efficient. The magic responded to her need and her blood, flowing in ways that bypassed normal channels and normal limitations, providing temporary relief to the unicorn while exhausting Ciri herself. The appearance of a Nilfgaardian soldier in the desert carried implications that would only become clear with time. His presence suggested patrol routes or supply lines that extended even into regions as hostile as Karath, military operations that required soldiers to traverse territories where survival was never guaranteed. His decision to provide assistance to Ciri rather than immediately recognizing her as a person of interest demonstrated either ignorance of the broader political situation or personal ethics that prioritized immediate humanitarian concerns over abstract duties to the Empire. The rescue transformed Ciri's immediate trajectory, removing her from the certainty of death in the desert and delivering her into the complex systems of military administration and occupied territory management that characterized Nilfgaardian control of the southern regions. She emerged from Karath alive, the unicorn's fate unknown, her own identity obscured by exhaustion and the practical difficulties of maintaining bureaucratic precision in frontier regions. The transition from Tanna to Karath to Nilfgaardian custody represented a descent through layers of security and certainty, each stage removing Ciri further from the structures that might have protected her and closer to the raw mechanics of survival that governed life in the war-torn territories. The portal had torn her from a world where she possessed identity and value, however contested, and deposited her in spaces where those attributes meant nothing. The desert had stripped away pretensions and pride, reducing existence to the immediate requirements of breath and heartbeat. The soldier's intervention had preserved her life while simultaneously binding her to systems whose operations she could neither control nor fully comprehend. She had survived the Karath desert, an achievement that few could claim, yet survival was proving to be its own form of curse, delivering her not to safety but to new forms of captivity and new descents into darkness that would ultimately lead her to a gang of young outlaws and a new identity forged in contempt. The mechanisms through which Ciri passed from the custody of a Nilfgaardian soldier into the hands of slavers remained obscured by the chaos that characterized occupied territories and the practical difficulties of maintaining bureaucratic order in regions where military priorities superseded civilian protections. The slave trade had flourished during the Nilfgaardian Wars, expanding from its traditional centers in the southern provinces into the newly conquered territories where displaced populations and collapsed legal structures created abundant opportunities for those willing to profit from human misery. Slavers operated in the margins between military authority and civilian administration, their activities tolerated or ignored by officials who lacked the resources to suppress them and who sometimes benefited from the secondary markets in goods and information that slave networks facilitated. The trade moved its merchandise along routes that paralleled legitimate commerce, using the same roads and occasionally the same caravans, distinguishing itself through the particular cargo that represented inventory rather than passengers. Ciri's capture by these networks represented a continuation of her descent from recognized identity into systematic dehumanization. The slavers viewed their captives through frameworks that reduced individuals to assessments of potential value, physical condition, age, beauty, skills, and the abstract quality of compliance that determined whether someone would be profitable or problematic. Young women occupied a particular position within this calculus, their value enhanced by the specific markets that existed for their labor and their bodies, their treatment calibrated to maintain that value while minimizing the resources expended on their maintenance. The conditions of captivity varied depending on the sophistication of the operation and the distance from markets where merchandise would be sold. Some slavers maintained facilities that approximated the cleanliness and order necessary to preserve their inventory's condition, while others operated on the assumption that losses during transport could be absorbed through volume. The trauma of this captivity operated on multiple levels, physical and psychological, immediate and accumulating. The physical constraints of chains or cages represented the most obvious dimension of control, limiting movement and reinforcing the helplessness that facilitated management of larger numbers of captives with smaller numbers of guards. The psychological dimensions proved more insidious and more enduring, the systematic stripping away of autonomy, the constant awareness that one's existence depended entirely on the whims of individuals who viewed suffering as economically irrelevant, the witnessing of what happened to those who resisted or who lost sufficient value to justify continued investment in their survival. Ciri carried with her training from Kayleigh knowledge of combat and survival that should have provided advantages in navigating dangerous situations, yet that training had presumed contexts where skill and determination mattered. Captivity rendered those attributes meaningless, creating conditions where the only available responses were endurance or the kind of internalized surrender that allowed captives to continue existing after everything that had made existence meaningful had been systematically dismantled. The circumstances that led to Ciri's separation from the slavers and her eventual encounter with the rats involved either escape or transfer, possibilities that carried different implications about her psychological state and her capacity for agency during this period. Escape would have required the convergence of opportunity and capability, a moment when supervision lapsed or when desperation overrode the calculations that normally prevented attempts that were likely to result in recapture and punishment. The alternative scenario involved transfer to different hands, perhaps through sale to buyers who intended to move their purchase immediately, or through the intervention of individuals whose interest in Ciri stemmed from recognition of who she might be rather than assessment of her value as generic merchandise. Either path would have deposited her into the territories where the rats operated, into the specific circumstances that would lead to her integration into their group. The psychological legacy of this period of captivity would shape Ciri's behavior and worldview in ways that became apparent only after she had gained the security that came with membership in the rats. The experience had demonstrated with absolute clarity that the world contained no inherent justice, no cosmic force that intervened to protect the vulnerable or punish the cruel. It had shown her that identity and lineage meant nothing when confronted with individuals whose power derived from immediate control rather than abstract legitimacy. The trauma had created a void where trust and hope might have resided, a space that would be filled by rage and the embrace of violence as a primary response to threat. She had survived the slavers through mechanisms that required the suppression of everything soft and vulnerable within herself, and that suppression would prove difficult to reverse even when circumstances no longer demanded it. The girl who approached the rats was already someone different from the princess who had fled Tanid, already someone capable of the descent that would transform her into Falka. The rejection of her birth identity represented more than a pragmatic decision to obscure her location from those who pursued her. Ciri's adoption of the name Falka constituted a symbolic self-destruction, a deliberate choice to align herself with one of the most cursed figures in continent history rather than to cling to the lineage and titles that had brought her nothing except suffering and displacement. Falka had been a princess of Redania, daughter of King Vredank, whose exclusion from succession due to the king's remarriage had sparked a rebellion that consumed the kingdom in flames. The historical Falka had become associated with curses and madness, with a rage so consuming that it transcended individual grievance and manifested as a desire to burn the entire structure of civilization. Legend attributed to her a curse on her own bloodline, a malediction that ensured her descendants would carry the potential for the same consuming fury that had defined her existence. For Ciri to claim this name was to embrace damnation, to announce that she recognized herself in the figure of the cursed princess rather than in the lineage of Cintra's nobility. The symbolic death of Cirilla allowed the birth of Falka, a transformation that operated simultaneously on multiple levels of identity and psychology. Cirilla had been defined by relationships: granddaughter of Queen Calanthe, heir to multiple thrones, ward of Geralt of Rivia, student of Yennefer of Vengerberg, bearer of elder blood whose destiny had been debated by powers ranging from sorceresses to emperors. These relationships had provided context and meaning, yet they had also made her a target, an object whose value derived from what she represented to others rather than what she might choose for herself. Falka, in contrast, was defined by rejection and rage, by a deliberate turning away from all structures of legitimate power and toward an identity forged in contempt and violence. The adoption of this name freed Ciri from the obligations of her past while simultaneously binding her to a legacy of destruction that validated the darkness growing within her. She announced through this choice that she would rather be remembered as a monster than forgotten as a victim, that she embraced the role of destroyer rather than waiting passively for the world to finish destroying her. The rats' response to the possibility of accepting a seventh member revealed the significance of this expansion. Their identity as a group of 6 had achieved a stability, an equilibrium where roles and relationships had been established through shared experience and mutual understanding. The introduction of a new member threatened this balance, raising questions about loyalty, about the distribution of resources and status, about whether the benefits of expansion outweighed the risks of disruption. Their astonishment at finding themselves willing to accept Ciri reflected an acknowledgement that something about her presence overrode their usual calculations. Perhaps they recognized in her a damage that matched or exceeded their own, a capacity for violence that made her valuable as an asset rather than vulnerable as a liability. Perhaps they saw in her ash-colored hair and her haunted expression something that spoke to their own experiences of displacement and trauma. The decision to accept her represented a departure from their established patterns, a choice that would reshape the rats' trajectory and ultimately contribute to their destruction. The prefect of Amarillo, when he eventually learned of the rats' expansion to 7 members, experienced an astonishment that mixed bureaucratic precision with superstitious unease. The number 6 had appeared in his reports and intelligence summaries with sufficient consistency to become a defining characteristic of the gang. The addition of a 7th member violated the pattern, suggesting either that his information network had failed to accurately track the group's composition or that something significant had changed in their organization. The prefect's astonishment also reflected a broader cultural discomfort with the number 7 when applied to groups that operated outside legitimate authority. 7 carried mystical and religious significance across multiple continent cultures, appearing in prophecies and folk beliefs in ways that 6 did not. A gang of 7 outlaws suggested something more organized, more permanent, more threatening than a gang of 6, as if the addition of that final member transformed a temporary alliance into something approaching an institution. The unprecedented nature of their expansion marked a threshold in the rats' existence, a moment when they transitioned from a known quantity into something that exceeded the categories used to classify and manage criminal enterprises. Falka's integration into the group brought capabilities and complications that the original 6 could not have anticipated. She carried within her the potential for magic that dwarfed anything available to the others, power that remained largely dormant during her time with the rats yet whose presence could be sensed by those attuned to such things. She also carried a price on her head that exceeded the combined value of all other rats many times over, a bounty that would eventually draw hunters of a caliber that the gang had never previously encountered. The girl who called herself Falka had found family among the rats, belonging in a community of mutual contempt and shared violence. Yet in finding them she had also signed their warrants, beginning the countdown toward the massacre that would end them all. The evening Ciri arrived among the rats marked a transformation whose roots stretched deeper than survival, deeper than the choice between captivity and freedom. She had fled one form of possession only to stumble into another, though this new cage wore the guise of belonging, of sanctuary offered in the language of mutual outcasts. The gang had taken her in with a mixture of curiosity and calculation, for theirs was a brotherhood forged in shared contempt for the world that had discarded them, and the ashen-haired girl seemed to embody that same contempt in her hollow gaze and the bruises that shadowed her skin. Giselher had permitted her entry with a shrug, Kayleigh with a sneer, Reef with indifference, but it was Mistle who watched her with an intensity that suggested recognition, as though she saw in Ciri's brokenness a mirror of her own. Mistle herself carried the weight of violation, a burden she had borne since long before the rats became her chosen family. Her past included an encounter with assault that had stripped from her any illusions about the benevolence of the world or the safety promised by civilization structures. She had survived by learning to wield her own desires as weapons, by refusing to be reduced to victim status, by embracing the role of predator when circumstances demanded it. Her cropped straw-colored hair, cut short like a brush, announced her rejection of conventional femininity, while her long legs and tall frame gave her a presence that commanded attention in any gathering of the gang. She moved through their camps with the confidence of one who had learned to navigate treacherous social waters, who understood the currency of power and the necessity of claiming it before others could claim it over her. The rats had made their camp in a barn outside one of the countless villages that dotted the Geso province, a structure whose owner either feared them too much to protest or had already fled the region entirely. The space smelled of old hay and horse sweat, and the autumn cold seeped through gaps in the wooden walls despite the fire they'd built in a cleared circle on the dirt floor. Ciri had been given blankets and a space near the periphery, far enough from the fire to feel the chill but close enough to see the faces of her new companions as they passed around a skin of wine and a small leather pouch containing fistek, the drug that many outlaws favored for its ability to dull pain and sharpen sensation in equal measure. She had not partaken, had barely spoken since Giselher declared her one of them, and the rats seemed content to let her acclimate at her own pace, though their glances suggested she would not be allowed to remain apart indefinitely. Mistle approached her when the others had begun to drift towards sleep, when Giselher and Iskra had retired to their own corner where soft murmurs and occasional laughter marked their intimacy, when Kayleigh lay sprawled near the fire with his malevolent eyes finally closed, when Reef and Asse had claimed their bedrolls with a weariness of young men who lived each day as though it might be their last. She moved with purpose, not stealth, and settled beside Ciri without asking permission, her presence both an offer and a claim. The physical contact began as comfort, as the touch of one who understood trauma offering solace to another freshly wounded, but it evolved into something far more complex, something that blurred the boundaries between care and coercion, between genuine affection and the assertion of dominance within the pack's social hierarchy. Ciri, whose recent captivity had left her numb to her own agency, whose sense of self had been so thoroughly shattered that even the concept of consent seemed abstract, did not resist. The encounter unfolded in silence, broken only by the crackling of the dying fire and the settling sounds of the barn's ancient timbers. Mistle's intentions seemed layered, simultaneously genuine in their attempt to forge connection and calculated in their assertion of possession. For among the rats all bonds were transactions and all intimacy carried the weight of survival politics. Ciri's compliance stemmed not from desire but from exhaustion, from the psychological state of one who had been reduced to object status so recently that reclaiming personhood felt impossible. She accepted Mistle's attention with the passivity of the profoundly traumatized, and in that acceptance something shifted in the chemistry of the gang, for Ciri had now been claimed, marked as belonging not just to the rats collectively but to Mistle specifically. The relationship that began that night would become one of the defining features of Ciri's time among the outlaws, a bond that observers would struggle to categorize, that Ciri herself would never fully understand, that combined elements of protection, exploitation, affection, and control in proportions that defied simple moral judgment. When dawn filtered through the barn's gaps, Ciri woke to find Mistle's arm draped across her shoulders, proprietary and reassuring in equal measure. The other rats stirred with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to irregular sleep and sudden departures, and if they noted the new configuration of their group's internal dynamics, they offered no comment beyond knowing glances. Giselher seemed pleased, perhaps viewing the development as confirmation of the gang's cohesion, while Kayleigh's expression suggested contempt laced with indifference, his hatred too generalized to focus on this particular manifestation of the world's cruelty. Iskra met Ciri's eyes with something that might have been sympathy or might have been recognition, the acknowledgement of one survivor to another that survival sometimes required accepting circumstances that could not be called chosen. Reef and Asse simply resumed their preparation for the day's activities, the business of banditry that would fill their hours and define their purpose. The psychological aftermath of that first night would shape everything that followed, would inform Ciri's gradual embrace of the rat's philosophy and her eventual descent into the violence that the gang celebrated as liberation. Mistle had offered her a place, had given her the illusion of mattering to someone, and in Ciri's shattered state that illusion felt substantial enough to build upon. The relationship would deepen over the coming weeks, would involve shared tattoos and whispered confidences and the particular intimacy that emerges among those who live outside society's protections, who must create their own codes and their own definitions of loyalty. Whether what existed between Ciri and Mistle constituted love or dependency, affection or Stockholm Syndrome, genuine connection or mutual exploitation, remained a question without simple answer, for the rats existed in a moral twilight where conventional categories dissolved and survival trumped idealism. The barn that had witnessed their first night together would be abandoned by midday, left behind as the rats moved on to their next target, their next theft, their next assertion of existence against a world that had marked them for irrelevance. Ciri rode beside Mistle, their horses moving in tandem across the autumn landscape of Geso, and the ashen-haired girl who had once been a princess, who had once been hunted across dimensions, who had once carried the weight of prophecy and the burden of power, began to recede. In her place emerged Falka, the name she had chosen to embody her rejection of her former self, and Falka belonged to the rats, belonged to Mistle, belonged to the philosophy of contempt that would guide her through the darkest period of her young life. The rhythm of existence with the rats followed patterns dictated by necessity, opportunity, and the peculiar philosophy that bound these young outcasts together. Their camps shifted with deliberate irregularity, sometimes occupying abandoned structures like barns or derelict farmhouses, other times claiming clearings in the forests that still covered much of Geso province despite Nilfgaard's administrative attempts to tame the landscape. The gang moved primarily on horseback, their mounts acquired through theft rather than purchase, each animal representing both transportation and a symbol of their rejection of lawful commerce. They traveled light, carrying only what could be packed quickly when pursuit threatened, which meant their possessions remained minimal and their attachment to material goods shallow despite the wealth that passed through their hands during successful robberies. The mornings in their camps began without ceremony or structure, each member rising according to personal inclination rather than any imposed schedule. Giselher, despite his role as unofficial leader, exercised authority through charisma and tactical suggestion rather than rigid command, allowing the rats to maintain the illusion of equality even as hierarchies of influence clearly existed. He and Iskra shared a bedroll most nights, their relationship providing a core stability to the gang's emotional architecture, a demonstration that intimacy could exist even in their harsh circumstances. Iskra, whose elvish heritage marked her as Inuidian to those who knew the elder speech, moved through the camps with the grace of her lineage, her colorful clothing and dancing movements a stark contrast to the grim violence that defined much of the rat's activities. Her big eyes held depths of experience that belied her youth, and her decision to free Giselher from the tree where an elven arrow had pinned him remained the foundational act of mercy that had ultimately led to the gang's formation. Kayleigh and Reef maintained their own partnership within the larger group, their bond forged during the siege of Ebbing when the former had chosen to save rather than finish off the injured Nilfgaardian soldier. Kayleigh's thin frame and long hair framed a face capable of expressions so malevolent that even fellow rats sometimes found his gaze unsettling, his hatred of the world burning with an intensity that never fully banked. His past included the betrayal of his own parents, a choice born from desperation that haunted him in moments of rare quietude, driving his need for acceptance within the gang even as his nature made true connection difficult. Reef provided balance to Kayleigh's volatility, his Nilfgaardian accent marking him as foreign among Nordlings, yet his experiences of abandonment by his own army creating common ground with the others' grievances. Together they had traveled the highways after escaping Ebbing, robbing primarily wealthy travelers and distributing some of their spoils in villages, establishing the pattern that would later define the rats' operations. Asse, with his broad shoulders and the fair curly down on his chin that suggested youth not yet hardened into full adulthood, occupied a role of quiet strength within the gang. His history as the blacksmith's son from Thurn who had witnessed pacifiers end his family carried weight in his movements, a heaviness born from trauma that manifested as physical power rather than Kayleigh's seething rage. His discovery of Mistle half expired in a ditch, his choice to save her life rather than pursue immediate vengeance against the army that had destroyed his world, revealed a capacity for compassion that coexisted uneasily with the violence the rats practiced. He and Mistle maintained a connection rooted in that moment of salvation, though it differed fundamentally from the romantic or physical bonds that characterized other relationships within the gang. The rats' daily activities centered on planning and executing robberies, though their targets and methods reflected their peculiar ethics. They scorned accumulation for its own sake, distributing much of their stolen goods to villages in the regions where they operated, creating a network of civilian protection that frustrated Nilfgaardian authorities' attempts to track or capture them. This strategic generosity stemmed less from altruism than from tactical calculation combined with genuine contempt for the concept of wealth as virtue. The rats attacked for entertainment as much as necessity, finding satisfaction in the act of theft itself rather than in the material rewards it produced. Their targets included military transports carrying grain, forage, salt, wood tar, and cloth, goods they promptly redistributed to communities impoverished by the ongoing wars. They also robbed individual travelers, though they preferred victims whose wealth seemed excessive or whose bearing suggested nobility or merchant success. The evenings brought respite and indulgence, periods when the gang gathered around fires to share food, wine, and fistek, the drug providing temporary escape from memories that haunted each member. The substance sharpened some sensations while dulling others, creating states of consciousness where the boundaries between pleasure and numbness blurred. Not all the rats partook equally, individual tolerances and preferences varying, but the communal nature of these sessions reinforced bonds and created shared experiences that transcended mere criminal alliance. Ciri, now Falka to her companions, gradually began participating in these rituals, her initial resistance eroding as the psychological need for belonging overrode her reservations. The relationship between Ciri and Mistle deepened during these weeks, evolving from the complex circumstances of their first night into something that resembled partnership, though observers might have struggled to categorize it precisely. Mistle demonstrated possessiveness over Ciri, acclaiming that the ashen-haired girl seemed to accept with a mixture of relief and resignation. They rode together, slept together, planned together, and the other rats adjusted to accommodate this pairing within their established dynamics. Iskra watched them with the knowing gaze of one who understood the complicated nature of relationships forged in survival circumstances, while Giselher seemed satisfied that Ciri's integration into the gang had proceeded smoothly. The conversations around their fires ranged from tactical discussions of upcoming targets to reminiscences about their pasts, though certain topics remained unspoken by mutual understanding. The rats shared a philosophy articulated in the phrase that had become their unofficial creed: "In times of contempt, anyone who stands alone must perish." This belief justified their cohesion and their refusal to accept additional members despite occasional opportunities to expand. They trusted only each other, despising outsiders with an intensity that made infiltration by Nilfgaardian agents impossible despite multiple attempts by the prefecture authorities. The close-knit group of 6 had created something rare in the landscape of banditry, a gang bound by genuine loyalty rather than mere convenience, and Ciri's acceptance as the 7th member marked an unprecedented exception to their exclusionary rule. Their clothing reflected their status as outlaws who had transcended mere survival to achieve a kind of grim prosperity through successful criminal enterprise. They wore garments stolen from the wealthy, boots taken from merchants, weapons acquired through violence or trade. Iskra favored colorful fabrics that honored her elvish aesthetic sensibility, while Mistle's practical choices reflected her rejection of conventional femininity. The rats maintained their gear with the care of those who understood that equipment failure could mean capture or demise, and they shared resources freely among themselves even as they hoarded nothing beyond immediate need. The girl who had once wielded magic with the precision of trained reflex, who had moved through dimensions with the elder blood singing in her veins, found herself stripped of those abilities during her time with the rats. The powers that had made her valuable to emperors and sorceresses, that had drawn prophecies and prompted pursuits across the continent, remained dormant throughout the months she spent as Falka. Whether this stemmed from psychological blockage born of trauma, from the corrupting influence of the curse associated with the name she had claimed, or from some other metaphysical cause remained unclear even to Ciri herself. The absence of her abilities forced her to engage with violence in its most direct physical forms, to become proficient with blade and fist rather than relying on the supernatural advantages that had previously defined her survival strategies. The transformation manifested gradually, each small act of cruelty building upon the last until violence became her instinctive response to conflict. The rats celebrated aggression as liberation, viewing their attacks on travelers and merchants as justified rebellion against a society that had marked them for disposal. Ciri absorbed this philosophy with the receptiveness of one seeking any framework that could give meaning to her suffering. She discovered that inflicting harm provided temporary relief from the constant ache of her own wounds, that watching others experience fear and pain created a perverse sense of control in a life where she had been rendered powerless. The cycle fed itself, each act of violence making the next easier, each robbery reinforcing the narrative that she and the rats existed outside and above the moral systems that governed ordinary people. Her skills with the sword, honed through years of training at Kayleigh under the tutelage of witches, found new and darker applications during raids. Where once she had practiced strikes and parries in the context of self-defense and monster hunting, she now employed those techniques to threaten, to maim, to end lives when the rats deemed it necessary or simply convenient. Giselher recognized her proficiency and began incorporating her abilities into their tactical planning, positioning her where her speed and precision could maximum impact during ambushes. She accepted these assignments with the blank compliance of one who had ceased to recognize moral boundaries, who had internalized the rat's contempt for the social order so thoroughly that individual suffering registered only as abstraction. The psychological mechanisms underlying her descent included displacement of her own trauma onto convenient targets. Unable to strike back at those who had truly harmed her, unable to reach the slavers who had held her captive or the forces that had shattered her life during the Tanid coup, she redirected her rage toward whoever happened to cross the rat's path. Merchants traveling with goods became surrogates for the systems that had failed to protect her. Nobles in carriages represented the hierarchies that had valued her only as a political asset. Soldiers embodied the wars that had consumed her childhood. She projected onto these strangers the accumulated resentment of her entire young life, and the rats provided both permission and encouragement for these projections to manifest as violence. Mistle's influence played a complex role in Ciri's transformation, simultaneously anchoring her to the gang and enabling her worst impulses. The bond between them carried a possessive quality that Mistle expressed through both affection and control, creating an environment where Ciri's identity became increasingly merged with her role as Falka, as member of the Rats, as Mistle's partner in all endeavors. When Ciri engaged in acts of cruelty, Mistle offered approval rather than restraint, viewing such behavior as evidence of Ciri's commitment to the gang's philosophy. The other Rats similarly reinforced these patterns, celebrating particularly audacious or ruthless acts during their evening gatherings, creating a social structure where moral deterioration brought status rather than shame. The fistek that circulated through their camps contributed to the erosion of Ciri's inhibitions, the drug-creating states where consequences felt distant and actions seemed divorced from their impacts. She began partaking more regularly as the weeks progressed, finding in the substance a temporary escape from the self-loathing that lurked beneath her embrace of the Falka persona. The chemical alteration of consciousness made violence easier, creating a buffer between intention and execution that allowed her to commit acts she might have hesitated over while fully present. The rat's casual relationship with the drug normalized its use, embedding it into the daily rhythms of their existence until distinguishing between sober decisions and chemically influenced choices became increasingly difficult. Her frustration at the absence of her powers manifested as compensatory aggression, as though physical violence could somehow replace the magical abilities she had lost. She pushed herself to excel with conventional weapons, practicing strikes and combinations during idle hours at their camps, driving her body to achieve through training what her blood no longer provided through gift. The Witcher techniques she had learned at Kaer served her well in these efforts, though the context had shifted from the disciplined environment of the Witcher stronghold to the anarchic world of the Rats. She became faster, more precise, more willing to press advantages and exploit weaknesses, her combat style evolving to reflect the ruthless pragmatism that the gang valued above all other qualities. The psychological cost of this transformation accumulated in ways Ciri refused to acknowledge, manifesting as nightmares that haunted her sleep and moments of dissociation where she observed her own actions as though watching a stranger. She developed mechanisms for suppressing empathy, for viewing victims as objects rather than persons, for constructing narratives that justified each robbery and each act of harm. The Rats' philosophy provided scaffolding for these rationalizations, their shared contempt for society creating an echo chamber where cruelty could be reframed as resistance. She told herself she had become what the world had forced her to be, that her violence represented justified response to the violence inflicted upon her, that the Rats offered the only honest relationship she had ever known. The person she had been before the Tanid coup, before the desert and the slavers and the first night with Mistle, receded into memory so distant it seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon, Princess of Cintra, child of the Elder Blood, existed now only as ghost, as rejected identity, as name she refused to speak or acknowledge. Falka had taken her place, Falka who embraced destruction, who found satisfaction in others' fear, who had learned to wield cruelty with the same precision she once applied to magic. The transformation would have consequences that extended far beyond her time with the Rats, shaping the woman she would eventually become, but in the immediacy of those autumn months she existed fully within the descent, falling deeper into darkness with each passing day. The fairground outside the town of Amarillo had drawn crowds from across the Geso province, merchants and entertainers converging to capitalize on the harvest festival that marked the season's turning. The Rats arrived with coins freshly stolen from a grain transport, their pockets heavy with silver that they intended to spend on pleasures rather than necessities, for accumulation held no appeal to those who lived each day as though permanence were illusion. The festival's atmosphere carried a forced gaiety, the sort of desperate celebration that emerges in war-torn regions where people grasp at normalcy despite the chaos that surrounds them. Jugglers performed beside fire eaters. Musicians played instruments whose strings vibrated with melodies meant to drown out thoughts of hardship, and vendors sold sweets and roasted meats to customers who chose temporary indulgence over prudent saving. Ciri moved through the crowds with Mistle at her side, their fingers intertwined in a casual display of intimacy that drew occasional glances from festival-goers who recognized the dangerous edge beneath the two young women's festive demeanor. The ashen hair that marked Ciri as distinctive had been partially concealed beneath a scarf, though not with any real concern for disguise, for the rats had grown bold in their operations and rarely bothered with elaborate precautions. They wandered past stalls selling ribbons and carved trinkets, paused to watch a puppet show whose violent comedy reflected the casual brutality that had become normalized across the war-ravaged provinces, and eventually found themselves drawn to a vendor offering spun sugar in colors that seemed impossibly bright against the autumn afternoon's fading light. The cotton candy vendor, an elderly woman whose weathered hands worked the spinning mechanism with practiced efficiency, greeted them with a wary courtesy that merchants reserved for customers whose appearance suggested potential trouble. Ciri requested 2 portions, specifying the blue color that reminded her of something she could no longer quite remember, some fragment of childhood that persisted despite her efforts to bury all connections to her former life. Mistle leaned against the stall's wooden frame, her cropped hair catching the late sunlight, her expression carrying the slight smirk that characterized her interactions with civilians. They waited while the vendor prepared their purchase, the sugar crystallizing into ethereal clouds on paper cones, the sweet scent mixing with the festival's other aromas of roasted nuts and smoke from cooking fires. The confrontation began with a comment from a man standing near the stall, his words directed at Ciri and Mistle with a particular venom reserved for women whose relationship violated conventional expectations. His appearance suggested neither soldier nor merchant, merely one of the countless displaced persons who populated the festival crowds, seeking entertainment or purpose or simply the comfort of human gathering. The nature of his remark carried implications about the two young women's intimacy, suggestions delivered with the crude hostility that some individuals deployed against those whose lives challenged their narrow understanding of acceptable behavior. His tone indicated he expected no consequences, that he viewed his verbal assault as permissible within the social dynamics of a crowded public space where witnesses might observe but rarely intervened. Ciri's response emerged without conscious deliberation, her hand moving to her blade with the reflexive speed that months of violence had cultivated. The motion carried none of the hesitation that might have characterized her earlier self, none of the moral calculation that once preceded her decisions to employ force. She drew and struck in a single fluid movement, the steel finding its target with the precision of witcher training applied to purposes far removed from the monster hunting for which such skills had been intended. The man's expression shifted from contempt to shock to nothing as he collapsed, his threat silenced permanently, his body joining the festival's detritus before most nearby observers fully registered what had transpired. The immediate aftermath unfolded in the peculiar silence that follows sudden violence in public spaces, a moment of collective processing where witnesses struggle to reconcile the normalcy of seconds prior with the irreversible rupture of the present. Mistle's reaction carried approval rather than horror, her slight smile indicating satisfaction with Ciri's decisive handling of the confrontation. The other rats, scattered throughout the festival but never truly distant from each other, materialized with a coordinated response of those accustomed to supporting their own during unexpected complications. Giselher's gaze swept the crowd, assessing threat levels and potential pursuit, while Kayleigh's malevolent eyes seemed to welcome the possibility of broader confrontation. The vendor, whose stall had become the site of this casual ending, extended the cotton candy with trembling hands, her survival instinct correctly identifying that compliance offered her best chance of avoiding becoming collateral damage. Ciri accepted both portions, passing one to Mistle with the same ease she might have employed in any ordinary transaction, her demeanor suggesting no awareness of moral transgression. They walked away from the stall together, stepping over the spreading pool that marked where the man had fallen, their boots tracking crimson patterns across the fairground's trampled grass. The festival's noise gradually resumed as the rats melted back into the crowds, individual witnesses choosing silence over the dangerous proposition of reporting what they had observed to authorities whose response times and effectiveness remained perpetually inadequate in the occupied territories. The cotton candy tasted sweet on Ciri's tongue, the sponge sugar dissolving with each bite, the simple pleasure of the treat entirely uncompromised by the violence that had preceded its acquisition. She consumed it while continuing through the festival, pausing occasionally to examine other vendors' offerings or watch performers whose acts seemed suddenly mundane compared to the casual demonstration of lethality she had just provided. Mistle walked beside her, their conversation touching on trivial matters, the incident already filed away as merely another assertion of their refusal to tolerate disrespect. The other rats rejoined them gradually, their own festival pursuits temporarily interrupted but resuming once they confirmed no immediate pursuit threatened the gang. The psychological distance between action and consequence, between taking a life and experiencing remorse, had grown so vast during Ciri's time with the rats that crossing it no longer registered as significant. The man who had made the hostile comment existed now only as absence, his removal from the world generating no more emotional response in Ciri than swatting an insect might provoke. The Falka identity she had constructed contained no space for guilt or second-guessing, only the perpetual assertion of dominance that the rats practiced as survival strategy and celebrated as philosophy. She finished the cotton candy as afternoon shaded toward evening, the sugar's residue sticky on her fingers, the memory of the incident already fading into the general background of violence that characterized her existence with the gang. The estate of the Baron of Cassidy sprawled across fertile lands that had somehow escaped the worst depredations of the ongoing wars, its prosperity marking it as exceptional in a province where most landowners struggled merely to maintain basic operations. The manor house rose behind stone walls that suggested defensive capability without the militarization that characterized true fortresses, a dwelling designed for comfort and status rather than sustained siege. The rats had identified the estate through their network of informants, peasants, and servants who provided intelligence in exchange for the coins and goods the gang distributed throughout the region. Word had reached them of a recent harvest festival where the Baron had displayed wealth with the careless ostentation of those who believed their position granted immunity from consequence. The raid commenced after nightfall, the rats approaching through orchards where autumn fruit hung heavy on branches that cast shadows in the moonlight. Giselher directed their movements with hand signals, positioning each member to maximize their effectiveness once they breached the manor's perimeter. Ciri moved with the practiced silence that months of banditry had refined, her earlier witcher training in stealth-finding application in contexts far removed from tracking monsters through forests. The estate's guards, few in number and poorly motivated, offered minimal resistance once the rats demonstrated their willingness to employ lethal force against anyone who impeded their access to the manor's interior. The household's occupants had gathered in a great hall where evidence of interrupted dinner remained on tables set with silver and crystal, the Baron's family and guests frozen in various postures of shock as the rats swept through the manor room by room. Giselher commanded the adults to remain still while his gang systematically collected valuables, moving through the estate with the efficiency born from experience in such operations. The Baron himself, a corpulent man whose face flushed with outrage tempered by fear, began protesting about connections to Nilfgaardian authorities and consequences that would follow this violation of his property. Kayleigh silenced him with a blow that sent the nobleman sprawling, establishing the futility of appeals to hierarchies that held no weight with those who had embraced their status as outlaws. Ciri encountered the Baron's daughter in an upstairs chamber where the child had attempted to hide when sounds of the raid reached her nursery. The girl appeared perhaps 8 years old, her fine clothing and the room's expensive furnishings marking her as someone who had known only privilege throughout her brief existence. She crouched behind a carved wooden chest, her eyes wide with terror as Ciri entered the chamber carrying a lamp that cast dancing shadows across walls decorated with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes of idealized rural life. The child's fear manifested in trembling silence, the sort of paralyzed response that emerges when danger exceeds all previous experience or imagination. The interaction that followed would later stand among the acts that most clearly illustrated how far Ciri had descended from the person she once had been. She approached the hiding child with deliberate slowness, drawing out the moment, allowing the girl's fear to build with each step that brought her closer. When she spoke, her words carried threats whose content violated fundamental boundaries that separate even criminals from true monsters, suggestions of violence so inappropriate to direct at a child that they revealed the profound corruption of Ciri's moral compass. She described acts she might perform, scenarios she might enact, painting verbal pictures designed to ensure the girl would carry nightmares long after the rats departed the estate. The psychological cruelty exceeded any practical purpose the raid required, serving no function beyond the infliction of trauma for its own sake. Ciri's motivation seemed rooted in her need to exercise power over someone even more vulnerable than she had been during her own captivity, a displacement of her accumulated suffering onto the nearest available recipient. The Baron's daughter represented everything Ciri had lost, the childhood security and innocence that the wars and conspiracies had stripped from her own life, and destroying that innocence in another provided perverse satisfaction. She continued her verbal assault until the child's terror reached levels that manifested as physical symptoms, the girl's body shaking with such intensity that speech became impossible. Mistle discovered them in the chamber during her own exploration of the manor's upper floors, her arrival interrupting Ciri's extended torment of the child. Her reaction carried neither condemnation nor approval, merely acknowledgement of what she witnessed, her expression suggesting this fell within the range of behaviors she considered acceptable from her partner. She informed Ciri that the others had finished collecting valuables and awaited her below, the practical concerns of completing the raid and departing before reinforcements arrived taking precedence over whatever was occurring in the nursery. Ciri left the child cowering behind the chest, traumatized beyond immediate recovery, her psychological wounds far exceeding any material loss the family would tally when assessing the raid's impact. The rats departed the estate with bags of silver, jewelry, and fine cloth that they would later distribute or sell according to their usual patterns. The Baron's protests about reporting the incident and pursuing justice rang hollow in a region where Nilfgaardian authorities had demonstrated consistent inability to apprehend the gang despite months of successful operations. The household would recover its material equilibrium eventually, replacing stolen items and repairing damaged doors, but the Baron's daughter would carry the encounter with Falka indefinitely, her nightmares populated by the ashen-haired girl who had shown her depths of cruelty she had never imagined existed. Ciri rode away from Cassidy alongside Mistle, their horses moving through the darkness toward whatever camp the rats would establish for the remainder of the night. The incident with the child registered in her consciousness as merely another event, another assertion of the power she wielded over those weaker than herself. The parallel between what had been done to her and what she had done to the Baron's daughter remained unexamined, blocked by psychological defenses that prevented her from recognizing herself as perpetrator rather than solely victim. The Falka persona she inhabited contained no mechanism for self-reflection, no capacity for recognizing that she had become manifestation of the very cruelties that had shattered her own life. The raid's success brought satisfaction to the rats, who celebrated their haul during the evening that followed, their laughter and songs echoing through whatever forest clearing sheltered them while the Baron's household miles away struggled to comfort a child whose innocence had been deliberately destroyed. The ritual of marking their bodies with permanent ink represented among the rats a commitment that transcended their daily criminal activities, transforming temporary alliance into something resembling kinship. Tattoos carried significance throughout the societies of the continent, serving various functions depending on context and culture, but among bandits and outlaws they functioned primarily as declarations of belonging to specific groups, as visible testimony to bonds that society's collapse had made necessary. The rats had adopted this practice early in their formation, each member bearing designs that announced their membership in the gang while simultaneously marking them as permanent outsiders from conventional society. The ink embedded beneath their skin served as both identification and commitment, for such markings could not be easily removed and carried consequences if authorities ever captured those who wore them. The designs favored by the gang reflected their chosen name and the philosophy underlying their existence. Rats appeared frequently in the imagery, sometimes rendered realistically and other times stylized into forms that blended with other symbolic elements. The creatures held particular resonance for the group, representing survival through adaptability, persistence despite persecution, and the ability to thrive in environments that destroyed others. Rats inhabited spaces humans abandoned, consumed what others discarded, multiplied despite attempts at extermination, and organized themselves into social structures that prioritized the group's survival over individual glory. These characteristics aligned perfectly with how the gang understood their own position within the continent's social order, making the vermin a fitting emblem for young people who had been marked as disposable by the societies that birthed them. The process of receiving tattoos involved both physical ordeal and social ceremony, the pain of the needle's repeated punctures serving as proof of commitment, while the gathered presence of fellow rats transformed individual marking into communal affirmation. The gang employed various tattooists encountered during their travels, sometimes compensating these artists with coins and sometimes compelling their services through less voluntary means. The quality of the work varied depending on the practitioner's skill, resulting in tattoos that ranged from crude and minimal to surprisingly detailed, though the rats seemed unconcerned with aesthetic perfection as long as the fundamental symbolism remained clear. What mattered was the act itself, the voluntary acceptance of permanent marking as declaration that they had chosen their path and would not seek return to the world that had rejected them. Ciri's acceptance of tattoos marked a significant threshold in her integration into the gang, a point beyond which retreat from the Falka identity became increasingly difficult. The decision to allow ink into her skin represented conscious choice to embrace the permanent consequences of her time with the rats, to accept that even if circumstances eventually separated her from the gang, evidence of this period would remain inscribed on her body. Mistle encouraged her toward this step, framing it as natural progression in their relationship and as proof of Ciri's genuine commitment to the bonds they had formed. The other rats similarly viewed her willingness to be tattooed as confirmation that she had moved beyond provisional membership into full acceptance of their shared identity. The specific design Ciri chose carried dual significance, marking her as rat while also establishing her particular connection to Mistle within the gang's internal dynamics. They selected matching imagery, complementary tattoos that announced their partnership to anyone familiar enough with the gang to recognize the significance of the identical markings. The location of these tattoos on their bodies remained a matter of private meaning between them, visible to each other and to fellow rats during the casual intimacy of camp life, yet concealable when circumstances required less obvious presentation. The shared experience of receiving the tattoos simultaneously, enduring the needle's bite while maintaining physical contact, created another layer of bonding that reinforced the complex relationship they had developed. Mistle's own collection of tattoos predated Ciri's arrival, accumulated during her time with the rats and bearing witness to various episodes and commitments from the gang's history. Some marked specific raids or victories, others commemorated losses or near disasters that had tested their cohesion, while certain designs simply reflected aesthetic choices or symbolic associations that resonated with her personal understanding of their shared identity. She explained the meaning behind each marking to Ciri during quiet moments at their camps, the narratives accompanying the images providing insight into the rat's evolution as a unit and Mistle's journey from a half-expired girl Asse had found in a ditch to the confident outlaw who now helped shape the gang's operations. The ritual surrounding tattoo acquisition included elements beyond the physical marking itself, extending into the evening celebrations that followed completion of new designs. The rats gathered around fires to examine and discuss the fresh ink, offering commentary that mixed genuine appreciation with a sort of crude humor that characterized their interactions. They passed around wine and fistek, the substances amplifying the sense of ceremony while dulling residual pain from the tattooing process. These gatherings reinforced bonds through shared attention to individual members' choices, creating moments where the gang's collective identity became palpable through focus on the symbols they had chosen to carry permanently. The permanence of tattoos carried particular weight for Ciri given her complicated relationship with identity throughout her young life. She had been Princess of Cintra, refugee, student at various institutions, pursued quarry of multiple factions, and now Falka of the Rats. Each previous identity had proven temporary, stripped away by circumstances or abandoned through conscious choice, leaving her with profound uncertainty about who she fundamentally was beneath the roles others had assigned or she had adopted. The tattoos represented an attempt to establish something fixed, to create through permanent marking a sense of self that could not be so easily discarded or destroyed. Whether this strategy would succeed or whether the ink would eventually serve merely as reminder of another temporary identity remained to be determined by futures she could not predict from within her current descent. The morning after receiving her tattoos, Ciri examined them in daylight that filtered through whatever structure sheltered the rats during that particular night. The skin surrounding the fresh ink remained tender, the body's inflammatory response creating redness and slight swelling that would subside over coming days as healing progressed. The designs themselves pleased her in ways she had not anticipated, providing tangible evidence of belonging that her psychological state desperately required. Mistle's matching tattoos, visible when her partner stirred beside her, created a sense of mirroring that reinforced their bond while simultaneously marking how thoroughly Ciri had been absorbed into the rat's world. The ashen-haired girl who bore these permanent markings existed at maximum distance from the princess who had once trained at Kayleigh. The gap between those identities now inscribed literally in ink that would outlast whatever came next. The reputation of the rats spread throughout the Nilfgaardian-occupied territories during the autumn and early winter months, their exploits becoming the subject of tavern conversations and marketplace gossip across provinces where entertainment remained scarce and dramatic news traveled swiftly. The gang's activities had escalated in both frequency and audacity, their successful evasion of authorities transforming them from minor nuisance into significant challenge to Nilfgaardian administrative control. Prefects in towns throughout Geso found themselves questioned by superiors about their inability to apprehend or even locate the young bandits whose robberies and violence seemed to mock the Empire's claims of bringing order to the conquered northern regions. The rats had become symbols of resistance in the popular imagination, though the reality of their motivations bore little resemblance to the heroic narratives that civilians constructed around them. The prefecture of Amarillo, where the gang had first coalesced and where they continued to operate most frequently, devoted considerable resources to tracking their movements. Officials compiled reports from witnesses, attempted to establish patterns in the rats' target selection, and deployed patrols along routes where previous robberies had occurred. These efforts produced minimal results, for the gang's movements followed no predictable schedule and their network of civilian supporters provided advance warning whenever authorities organized serious pursuit. The peasants and townspeople who benefited from the rats' redistribution of stolen goods had no incentive to cooperate with Nilfgaardian investigators, viewing the young bandits as preferable to the occupying forces that extracted taxes and conscripted labor for the Empire's ongoing military campaigns. Wanted posters began appearing in public spaces throughout the region, crude woodblock prints that attempted to capture the rats' distinctive features for identification purposes. These notices offered rewards for information leading to their capture, though the amount specified remained modest compared to bounties placed on more politically significant outlaws. The images bore varying degrees of accuracy depending on how much reliable description the artists had received from witnesses willing to speak with authorities. Giselher appeared as a grim figure with dark hair, Kayleigh's malevolent expression translated into exaggerated menace, Reef's height emphasized, Mistle's cropped hair rendered in harsh lines, Iskra's elvish features noted, and Asse's broad shoulders marked. The sixth member's identity remained officially uncertain for some time, as witnesses provided conflicting descriptions and authorities struggled to reconcile reports of a tall young man with fair curly down on his chin with the gang's actual composition. The addition of a seventh member generated particular interest among those tracking the rats, for the gang's exclusivity had been well established through their consistent refusal to expand beyond 6 members despite numerous opportunities. When reports began circulating about an ashen-haired girl riding with the notorious bandits, the prefecture officials in Amarillo expressed the sort of astonishment that found its way into official correspondence. The unprecedented nature of this expansion suggested something exceptional about the new member, prompting speculation about her identity and her relationship to the existing gang structure. Some witnesses claimed she fought with remarkable skill, others noted her youth, and a few provided descriptions detailed enough that those with access to broader intelligence networks might have recognized elements of the Princess of Cintra's reported appearance. The gossip about the ashen-haired rat spread beyond official channels into the general population's conversations, becoming one of the more intriguing aspects of the gang's growing legend. Tavern discussions debated who she might be and what circumstances had led to her acceptance into a group famous for rejecting all potential recruits. Some stories painted her as particularly dangerous, attributing to her acts of violence that exceeded even the established brutality of her companions. Other narratives emphasized her apparent relationship with Mistle, the two women's partnership noted by witnesses who had observed them during raids or spotted them together at festivals and markets. The combination of mystery surrounding her identity and the visible bond with another female gang member made her a figure of particular fascination in a society where such relationships, while not uncommon, typically remained more discreet. The rats themselves seemed unconcerned with their increasing fame, treating the wanted posters as sources of amusement rather than serious threats. They occasionally collected the notices when encountered, examining the artistic representations with critical commentary and mocking laughter that suggested genuine confidence in their ability to evade capture. Kayleigh particularly enjoyed tearing down his own poster, his hatred of authority finding satisfaction in defacing official proclamations even when such acts served no practical purpose. Giselher viewed the attention more strategically, recognizing that excessive notoriety might eventually attract response from Nilfgaard beyond what provincial prefects could muster, though he seemed to calculate the risk as acceptable given the advantages their fame provided in dealing with civilian populations. The network of support that sustained the rats' operations expanded proportionally to their growing reputation. Villages where they distributed stolen goods became increasingly willing to provide shelter, supplies, and intelligence about patrol movements. Merchants who benefited from purchasing the gang's stolen items at reduced prices maintained contacts that allowed the rats to convert material goods into coin when necessary. Even some lower-level Nilfgaardian officials found ways to profit from selective blindness regarding the gang's activities, accepting bribes in exchange for delayed responses or misdirected patrols. The corruption that had spread throughout the occupied territories created an environment where determined outlaws with popular support could operate with surprising freedom despite official efforts to suppress them. Ciri's integration into this network of relationships proceeded naturally as witnesses increasingly accepted her presence among the rats. The name Falka began appearing in reports alongside descriptions of the ashen-haired girl, though authorities seemed uncertain whether this represented her actual name or merely an alias she had adopted. Those familiar with Nordling history might have recognized the reference to the infamous rebellious princess whose cursed legacy haunted certain bloodlines, though whether the young bandit understood the full significance of the name she bore remained unclear to outside observers. The rats themselves used the name casually, having accepted Ciri's self-identification without demanding explanation or expressing concern about potential symbolic implications. The winter months approached as the gang's fame reached its peak, their faces now familiar throughout Geso and neighboring provinces where word of their exploits traveled through normal channels of communication. They had achieved a status rare among bandits, becoming known individuals rather than anonymous criminals, their personalities and relationships the subject of popular speculation. This visibility carried dangers they had not yet fully confronted, for fame attracted attention from forces far more dangerous than provincial prefects with limited resources and questionable motivation. The same networks that spread stories about the rats' daring raids also carried information to those who hunted valuable targets for profit, and an ashen-haired girl riding with notorious bandits might interest parties whose reach extended far beyond local jurisdictions. The imperial palace in Nilfgaard's capital housed a deception of extraordinary magnitude, a substitution that carried implications for succession, legitimacy, and the empire's relationship with the conquered northern territories. The girl presented to court as Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon, Princess of Cintra and intended bride for Emperor Emhyr var Emrys, bore superficial resemblance to the genuine article while lacking any legitimate claim to the identity she had been compelled to assume. The impostor's origins remained obscure even to most members of the inner circle who knew of the substitution, Her selection based on physical similarity and her compliance ensured through methods that combined coercion with promises of elevation far beyond her actual station. She performed her role adequately for audiences unfamiliar with the real Ciri's mannerisms and personality, though anyone who had known the Princess of Cintra intimately would have recognized immediately that this girl was merely wearing another's identity like an ill-fitting garment. The conspiracy behind the false Ciri's presentation involved key figures within Nilfgaard's political apparatus who had their own reasons for perpetuating the deception even after discovering its fraudulent nature. Stefan Skellen, known throughout intelligence circles by the epithet Tawny Owl for his nocturnal habits and predatory patience, occupied a central role in the web of schemes surrounding the real and false Ciris. His position within the Empire's security apparatus granted him access to information and resources that he deployed in pursuit of objectives that sometimes aligned with and sometimes diverged from the Emperor's stated interests. Skellen understood that controlling the genuine Princess of Cintra meant controlling access to bloodline prophecies and elder blood capabilities that could reshape the continent's political landscape, making the impostor's existence both useful misdirection and potential liability depending on circumstances. The revelation that the girl in Nilfgaard represented substitution rather than prize reached certain circles through intelligence networks that operated across factional boundaries. Whispers began circulating among those positioned to hear such sensitive information, suggestions that the Emperor's intended bride lacked authenticity despite official proclamations. These rumors created uncertainty among Nilfgaard's political class about succession plans and the Empire's claims regarding Cintra's legitimate heir. Some members of the inner circle viewed the deception as pragmatic necessity given the real Ciri's disappearance after the Tanid coup, while others recognized it as vulnerability that enemies might exploit if they could produce the genuine princess to challenge the impostor's position. The implications of maintaining a false Ciri extended beyond immediate political considerations into questions about prophecy and the elder blood significance. The legitimate bearer of that bloodline carried capabilities that the impostor could never manifest, meaning any plans dependent on actually accessing those powers rather than merely claiming political legitimacy through Cintran succession would require locating and securing the real princess. Certain factions within Nilfgaard's complex political structure understood this distinction and began developing strategies for finding Ciri while simultaneously maintaining the useful fiction of the impostor's presence at court. The dual-track approach allowed them to preserve current arrangements while preparing for possibilities that might emerge if the genuine article could be captured. Reports about an ashen-haired girl riding with a notorious rats gang in Geso province eventually reached intelligence analysts, whose responsibilities included tracking potential sightings of high-value targets. The descriptions provided by witnesses matched elements of the real Ciri's appearance closely enough to warrant investigation, though the context seemed improbable given expectations about how a princess might behave after escaping captivity. The idea that Cirilla of Cintra would join bandits rather than seeking refuge with allies or attempting to reach safety in remaining independent territories challenged assumptions held by those accustomed to thinking within conventional frameworks about nobility and proper behavior. Nevertheless, the possibility that the reports referred to the genuine princess rather than some coincidental look-alike demanded verification given the stakes involved. Skellen received these intelligence reports with a calculating attention he devoted to any information that might advance his objectives. The timing of the sightings, occurring months after the Tanid coup and in provinces far from where most observers expected Ciri to surface, suggested a journey through circumstances that had stripped away whatever support network she might once have relied upon. The association with bandits indicated desperation or psychological deterioration that could be exploited if she could be extracted from the gang and brought under control. Skellen began formulating plans that would require careful execution given the rats' reputation for violence and their support among civilian populations in the regions where they operated. The decision to pursue the real Ciri while maintaining the false one at court required coordination among conspirators who understood the delicate balance being attempted. Moving too openly against the rats might alert other factions who had their own interests in locating the Princess of Cintra, creating competition that could compromise Skellen's objectives. The operation would need to appear routine from outside perspectives, framed as ordinary law enforcement against bandits rather than targeted extraction of a politically valuable individual. This consideration led to choices about methodology and personnel that would shape the tragedy eventually awaiting the rats in a town called Jealousy. The false Ciri in Nilfgaard's palace remained ignorant of these developments, her role requiring only that she continue performing the part assigned to her while actual power brokers maneuvered around questions of authenticity and succession. She attended court functions, participated in ceremonies designed to reinforce her claimed identity, and endured the peculiar isolation of someone who must constantly perform an identity that belongs to another. Her handlers ensured she received information carefully curated to prevent her from understanding the full scope of the deception or recognizing how thoroughly she was being used. The comfort and status she enjoyed remained contingent on continued compliance, a reality communicated through subtle reminders rather than overt threats. The real Ciri, riding through Geso province with the rats and answering to the name Falka, remained unaware that her existence as bandit had been noted by forces whose reach extended far beyond provincial authorities. She continued participating in the gang's raids and robberies, her days filled with the immediate concerns of survival and the artificial sense of belonging the rats provided. The identity she had fled continued to exert gravitational pull despite her attempts at rejection, drawing attention and interest from factions who viewed her as asset rather than person. The false Ciri in Nilfgaard's palace and the real Ciri riding with bandits existed in a strange symmetry, each trapped in circumstances neither fully understood, each performing roles that served purposes beyond their comprehension or control. The mechanisms of professional violence operated throughout the continent according to principles that transcended political boundaries and factional loyalties, creating a class of individuals whose services could be purchased by anyone willing to meet their prices. Bounty hunters occupied a particular niche within this economy of sanctioned harm, specialists who tracked and captured or eliminated designated targets in exchange for predetermined compensation. Their profession required skills that combined tracking ability, combat proficiency, and the psychological detachment necessary to treat human beings as quarry whose value existed solely in monetary terms. The most successful practitioners achieved reputations that allowed them to command premium rates, their past accomplishments serving as credentials that justified the substantial investments required to secure their services. Stefan Skellen understood the utility of employing such specialists for operations that demanded both competence and deniability. His position within Nilfgaard's intelligence apparatus granted him access to funds that could be directed toward objectives without requiring detailed accounting to superiors who might question certain methodologies. The rats presented a challenge that conventional military or law enforcement approaches had failed to resolve despite months of effort by provincial authorities. Their network of civilian support, their mobility, and their willingness to employ lethal force against pursuers created conditions where standard tactics proved ineffective. Eliminating the gang would require operators capable of thinking beyond rigid institutional frameworks, individuals motivated by profit rather than ideology and unburdened by the bureaucratic constraints that limited official responses. The Commission Skellen offered focused specifically on destroying the rats while ensuring the ashen-haired girl survived for capture. This dual requirement of thoroughness regarding some targets and precision regarding others demanded practitioners capable of discriminating execution even in the chaos of combat. The bounty specified amounts for confirmed termination of the 6 original gang members while offering a substantially larger sum for delivery of the 7th member alive and in conditions suitable for interrogation. The discrepancy in compensation communicated clearly which objective mattered most while acknowledging that achieving it would likely require addressing the protective barrier the other rats provided around their newest member. Word of the contract circulated through the networks where such information traveled, reaching individuals and groups who specialized in this variety of work. The offered amounts attracted interest from multiple quarters, for the sums represented significant wealth even by the standards of successful bounty hunters. Some potential contractors recognized the rat's reputation and calculated that the risk matched the reward, while others viewed the young ages of the targets as suggesting the operation would prove simpler than pursuing more experienced criminals. The requirement to capture one target alive complicated tactical planning, for for maintaining control over a single individual during broader combat created vulnerabilities that purely lethal operations avoided. Among those who received information about the bounty was a hunter known professionally as Nightingale, whose career had established him as reliable if not exceptional within his profession's hierarchy. His skills leaned toward tracking and surveillance rather than direct confrontation, making him useful for operations that required locating elusive targets before applying force. Nightingale understood his limitations and typically worked as part of teams that combined his reconnaissance abilities with others' combat capabilities. The Rat's contract interested him primarily for the substantial payout rather than any particular confidence in his ability to accomplish it independently, leading him to seek partnerships that might improve success probability while allowing shared distribution of the eventual reward. The half-elf who joined Nightingale's effort brought skills acquired through military service followed by desertion, his background providing familiarity with tactics and violence that civilian hunters often lacked. His reasons for abandoning his unit remained his own concern, though desertion during wartime suggested either ideological disillusionment or pragmatic recognition that survival odds improved outside formal military structures. The partnership he formed with Nightingale reflected the sort of temporary alliance common among bounty hunters, a collaboration based on complementary capabilities and mutual assessment that cooperation served individual interests better than competition. They began gathering intelligence about the Rat's movements and patterns, interviewing witnesses, examining sites of previous raids, and attempting to predict where the gang might surface next. The true danger to the Rats emerged from a different source entirely, from a bounty hunter whose reputation existed on a level far removed from the competent but ordinary professionals who initially pursued Skellen's contract. Leo Bonhart occupied a category unto himself within the profession's informal hierarchy, his name spoken with a mixture of awe and revulsion reserved for those whose capabilities exceeded normal human parameters. His career had produced a catalogue of successful hunts that included targets most practitioners would have declined as impossibly dangerous. Bonhart's methodology combined patience that bordered on obsessive with combat skills that witnesses claimed approached or exceeded Witcher-level proficiency, creating a hunter who could track prey across provinces and continents before striking with overwhelming force at moments of maximum vulnerability. Bonhart's interest in the Rat's contract stemmed partially from the substantial monetary reward and partially from the challenge represented by multiple targets operating as coordinated unit. He had built his reputation largely through solo eliminations of individual high-value targets, and the prospect of engaging an entire gang simultaneously offered opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that his previous work had only hinted at. The requirement to capture one target alive rather than simply terminating all of them added complexity that he viewed as acceptable constraint rather than serious limitation, for his confidence in his own abilities bordered on absolute. He accepted Skellen's commission with terms that granted him priority claim, effectively warning other bounty hunters that interference would be treated as hostile action. The infrastructure supporting Skellen's operation extended beyond simply hiring capable hunters to include intelligence gathering about the Rat's activities and movements. Informants in Geso province received compensation for providing timely reports about sightings and rumors, creating a network that fed information upward through channels that eventually reached those coordinating the bounty hunters' efforts. This system operated parallel to official law enforcement attempts to track the gang, sometimes producing more accurate intelligence than prefectural authorities managed to collect despite their greater resources. The combination of financial incentive and professional tracking expertise created conditions where the Rat's previous success at evading capture would face challenges of unprecedented sophistication. The gang continued their operations unaware that the nature of pursuit had fundamentally changed, that they now faced hunters whose capabilities and motivation exceeded anything provincial patrols could muster. Their confidence born from months of successful evasion created a psychological vulnerability, a sense of invincibility that would make them slower to recognize genuine threat when it finally materialized. The Rats had defeated amateurs and frustrated bureaucrats, but they had never confronted someone like Bonhart, had never experienced what occurred when professional violence focused its full attention on targets it had marked for destruction. The convergence of forces gathering against them operated beyond their awareness as they rode through Geso, planning their next raids and celebrating their growing notoriety. The man who would become the instrument of the rats' destruction carried a reputation that preceded him through every territory where professional violence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Leo Bonhart had operated as bounty hunter for decades, accumulating a record of successful contracts that spanned the continent's geography and included targets whose capabilities should have rendered them uncatchable by ordinary means. His appearance suggested neither the theatrical menace of characters from popular tales nor the brutish physicality associated with common thugs, presenting instead as an older man whose lean build and weathered features might have allowed him to pass unremarked through crowded markets or taverns. This capacity for appearing unremarkable served him well in a profession where premature recognition often meant lost opportunities or compromised approaches. The stories circulating about Bonhart's career included claims that strained credibility among those unfamiliar with his actual capabilities. The most notorious assertion held that he had successfully hunted and terminated 3 witches, collecting their medallions as trophies that he wore as proof of these accomplishments. Witches represented apex predators in the continent's ecosystem of violence, their mutations and training producing combatants whose reflexes, strength, and skill exceeded normal human parameters by margins that made them legendary. The idea that any ordinary human could defeat one witcher in single combat challenged belief, while claiming to have bested 3 suggested either fabrication or capabilities that transcended conventional understanding of human limitations. Bonhart wore the medallions openly, 3 metal symbols representing the schools of those he claimed to have defeated, inviting skepticism from doubters while simultaneously warning the informed that they faced someone exceptional. The verification of Bonhart's claims remained difficult given the secretive nature of witcher populations and their tendency to operate independently across vast territories. Some observers noted that acquiring witcher medallions through means other than direct combat remained theoretically possible, that a cunning individual might obtain such items through theft, trade, or recovery from deceased witches who had fallen to other causes. These skeptics offered their doubts quietly, for Bonhart's demonstrated proficiency in actual documented contracts suggested that even if some embellishment colored his self-presentation, the core competence backing his reputation existed beyond question. Those who had witnessed him fight or survived encounters where he eliminated other dangerous individuals understood that whether or not he had actually defeated witches, he possessed skills that made the claim plausible rather than absurd. His methodology reflected patience developed across years of successful hunts, an understanding that rushing toward confrontation often meant failure while careful preparation created conditions favoring the hunter over the hunted. Bonhart invested substantial time in intelligence gathering before engaging targets, learning their patterns, identifying their associates, mapping their support networks, and determining where they felt safest. This preparation phase might extend for weeks or months depending on the target's elusiveness and the complexity of circumstances surrounding them. He viewed this investment as necessary rather than optional, recognizing that information constituted advantage more valuable than superior weaponry or physical prowess, though he possessed both of those attributes as well. The psychological dimension of Bonhart's hunting incorporated deliberate cultivation of dread in his targets once he chose to make his presence known. He understood that fear degraded combat effectiveness, that prey who recognized themselves as hunted made errors they would otherwise avoid. His approach often included allowing targets to become aware they were being pursued while denying them clear understanding of when or where confrontation would occur. This strategy transformed their existence into perpetual anticipation of violence, exhausting them mentally and emotionally before physical engagement commenced. The technique required confidence in his ability to control situations even after targets knew they faced threat. But Bonhart's record suggested this confidence rested on accurate assessment of his capabilities rather than delusional overestimation. The contract on the rats aligned with Bonhart's preferences for operations that offered both substantial compensation and opportunity to demonstrate skills that routine bounty work rarely required. The gang's reputation for violence and their success at evading capture presented the sort of challenge he found professionally satisfying, while the specific requirement to capture one target alive added complexity that elevated the operation beyond simple elimination work. He accepted Skellen's terms after brief negotiation that established his autonomy in tactical decisions and his sole claim to the bounty, conditions the Tawny Owl granted in exchange for Bonhart's commitment to prioritize this contract over competing opportunities. The intelligence Bonhart received about the rats included details accumulated through the network Skellen had established across Geso province. He studied reports of their raids, analyzed witness descriptions of their individual fighting styles, and identified patterns in their movement across the region. The information revealed a gang whose cohesion and mutual trust created strength that exceeded the sum of individual capabilities. 6 young people who fought as coordinated unit rather than collection of separate combatants. This coordination would need to be disrupted if he intended to control the engagement's outcome, for allowing them to support each other during confrontation would multiply the tactical challenges he faced. The specific focus on capturing the ashen-haired girl alive required Bonhart to develop an approach that isolated her from protective elements while neutralizing those elements permanently. His assessment concluded that attempting to extract her while the other rats remained capable of intervention would likely fail or force him to terminate her in self-defense, violating the contract's central requirement. The logical sequence involved eliminating her companions first, removing their capacity to interfere, before addressing the complicated matter of subduing someone trained in combat without causing damage that would reduce her value to those who had commissioned her capture. This tactical framework shaped his subsequent planning and determined the methods he would employ when opportunity finally presented itself. Bonhart's preparation included acquiring specific intelligence about locations the rats might visit during their continued operations. He identified towns where they had previously surfaced, establishments they had patronized, and individuals within their support network who might provide information about future plans. This research produced a list of probable destinations that he monitored through combination of personal reconnaissance and paid informants, whose loyalty he purchased with portions of the substantial advance Skellen had provided. The patient accumulation of positional advantage characterized his approach, building toward moment when all variables aligned to allow decisive action with minimal risk of the targets escaping before he could complete his objective. The psychological profile Bonhart constructed of the rats suggested confidence born from months of successful evasion had made them complacent regarding threats they considered beneath concern. They had defeated or evaded provincial authorities repeatedly, creating belief in their own invincibility that would slow their recognition of genuine danger when it materialized. This assessment proved correct, for the gang continued operating with the casual boldness of those who had forgotten that luck eventually exhausts itself and that every successful escape from consequence increases probability of eventually encountering consequence that cannot be escaped. Bonhart waited with the patience of predators who understand that prey's overconfidence represents opportunity, preparing himself for the convergence that would transform the rats from notorious success story into cautionary tale about the limits of mortal fortune. The halfling who appeared at the rats' camp carried news whose urgency his measured delivery only partially concealed, for Hotspur had survived years of navigating the continent's dangerous landscapes through combination of useful information and careful neutrality that allowed him to interact with multiple factions without becoming target himself. His presence among the gang represented neither accident nor casual visit, for halflings rarely wandered into bandit camps without specific purpose compelling them to risk such encounters. The rats knew him through previous interactions where mutual benefit had established relationship based on pragmatic exchange rather than friendship, Hotspur providing intelligence about patrol movements and market opportunities in return for portions of goods the gang distributed or sold. His arrival during late autumn afternoon found them in forest clearing where they had established temporary camp, their horses grazing nearby while evening meal preparations occupied some members and idle conversation engaged others. Giselher received Hotspur with a courtesy the gang extended toward useful contacts, offering food and position near the fire while inquiring about circumstances that had brought the halfling to seek them specifically rather than waiting for chance encounter in some town or marketplace. Hotspur accepted the hospitality before explaining that information had reached him through networks he maintained among merchants and travelers, rumors concerning Nilfgaardian activities that seemed directed at the rats specifically rather than representing general law enforcement efforts. The prefecture in Amarillo had begun offering amnesty to gang members willing to surrender, promising pardons and even monetary rewards for those who abandoned their criminal activities and provided information about their former associates. This development suggested escalation in official response, shift from attempting capture to encouraging betrayal through incentives that might appeal to outlaws whose loyalty depended on shared circumstances rather than deeper bonds. The rats' reaction to news of amnesty offers combined amusement with contempt, for their philosophy rejected the notion that returning to society's margins represented improvement over their current existence. Kayleigh's laugh carried particular bitterness, his malevolent eyes reflecting absolute certainty that no offered pardon could compensate for what civilization had taken from him. Iskra expressed similar skepticism through gestures that combined her elvish grace with dismissive finality, while Reef's Nilfgaardian accent colored his observations about how little trust could be placed in official promises from the Empire that had abandoned him after his military service ended in desertion. Giselher listened to their responses before indicating to Hotspur that the gang appreciated the information though they considered it irrelevant to their intentions, for none among them harbored interest in accepting terms from authorities whose legitimacy they fundamentally rejected. The halfling nodded acknowledgement of their position before introducing the second element of intelligence he had brought, information that carried weight of different magnitude than mere amnesty offers. Word had circulated among those who trafficked in such knowledge that a bounty hunter of exceptional reputation had accepted contracts specifically targeting the rats. Hotspur spoke the name Leo Bonhart with a careful pronunciation of someone aware that the individual represented genuine threat rather than ordinary hired violence. He described what he knew of Bonhart's history, the successful contracts against dangerous targets, the rumors about Witcher medallions, the methodology that combined patience with overwhelming force applied at moments of maximum vulnerability. The information came second-hand and third-hand, filtered through the sorts of conversations that occurred in taverns and trading posts where those involved in criminal enterprises or bounty hunting shared gossip about their profession's notable practitioners. The rats' response to Bonhart's name varied according to individual temperament and experience. Asse's broad shoulders shifted slightly as he processed the information, his expression suggesting he took the warning more seriously than the amnesty offer. Mistle glanced toward Ciri with look that might have carried concern or calculation, awareness that the ashen-haired girl's presence among them could be drawing attention beyond what their criminal activities alone would attract. Giselher questioned Hotspur about details, seeking to understand whether the bounty represented specific targeting or merely general contract available to any hunter interested in pursuing notorious bandits. The halfling provided what information he possessed while acknowledging limits of his knowledge, for Bonhart's operations typically remained obscured until he chose to reveal himself through action rather than advance warning. Ciri absorbed the information with the same detachment that characterized her responses to most developments during her time as Falka. The name Bonhart meant nothing to her beyond abstract threat, another pursuer in the long catalogue of forces that had sought her throughout her young life. She had fled Nilfgaardian soldiers, evaded agents of various political factions, survived encounters with creatures and circumstances that should have ended her, and the addition of one more hunter to the list failed to penetrate the psychological armor she had constructed around her current identity. The rats had provided protection through their numbers and their skills, and her confidence in their collective ability to handle threats had grown through months of successful operations where violence consistently resolved in their favor. The conversation evolved into discussion of whether the gang should alter their patterns in response to Hotspur's warnings or maintain their current approach. Some members advocated for increased caution, suggesting they avoid larger towns and limit their raids to targets that could be struck quickly before retreating to more remote camps. Others viewed such adjustments as unnecessary concessions to threats that might prove exaggerated or entirely fabricated, pointing out that rumors often exceeded reality and that changing behavior based on unverified intelligence represented weakness. Giselher occupied middle position, acknowledging value in awareness while questioning whether specific modifications to their operations would meaningfully reduce whatever risk Bonhart represented if he had indeed accepted contract against them. Hotspur observed these deliberations without pressing his case beyond the initial warnings, understanding that the rats would make their own decisions regardless of his recommendations. His responsibility extended only to providing information he considered relevant to their survival, a service he performed partially from genuine concern for acquaintances who had treated him fairly and partially from pragmatic recognition that the gang's continued existence served his commercial interests through their redistribution of goods and coins. When the discussion concluded without clear consensus on specific responses, he accepted their thanks along with payment for his journey to find them. Small compensation that honored the value of intelligence even when recipients chose not to act decisively upon it. The peculiar element in Hotspur's visit emerged when he suggested to Ciri that she might consider traveling with him for a period, leaving the rats temporarily while the situation regarding Bonhart clarified. His proposal came framed as pragmatic precaution rather than abandonment, noting that her distinctive appearance made her particularly visible and that the halfling's own travels might offer safer context than remaining with the notorious gang. The offer surprised the other rats, who had grown accustomed to viewing Ciri as permanent member rather than someone who might depart voluntarily. Mistle's reaction carried particular intensity, her possessiveness manifesting as opposition to any suggestion that involved separation from her partner. Ciri briefly considered Hotspur's proposition, evaluating whether accepting might indeed provide tactical advantage or whether it represented retreat from the bonds she had formed with the rats. The decision required weighing abstract threat represented by Bonhart against immediate belonging she felt among the gang, calculating whether survival through temporary separation outweighed psychological cost of leaving what had become her anchor in a world that had repeatedly proven hostile. She chose to remain with the rats, her loyalty to Mistle and the group overwhelming whatever rational assessment might have suggested about danger. Hotspur accepted her refusal without argument, wishing them fortune before departing the camp to continue his own journey through territories where winter would soon make travel more difficult. The evening after Hotspur's departure found the rats discussing his warnings around their fire, the conversation gradually shifting from serious tactical considerations to mockery of the idea that any single hunter posed significant threat to their collective strength. They had grown confident through months of success, their youth and their shared contempt for authority combining to create sense of invulnerability that the halfling's sober warnings had failed to penetrate. They would continue operating as before, maintaining their patterns and pursuing their next planned destination, unaware that the very confidence and predictability that had served them during encounters with provincial authorities represented vulnerabilities when facing an opponent like Bonhart, who specialized in exploiting exactly such psychological blind spots. The town of Jealousy occupied an unremarkable position along trade routes that connected larger settlements in Geso province, its existence justified by geographic convenience rather than any particular strategic or economic significance. The name itself derived from local folklore whose specifics had been lost to time, leaving only the designation that travelers pronounced with varying degrees of amusement or indifference depending on their familiarity with the region's peculiarities. The settlement featured the standard amenities of such places: taverns that served food and lodging to merchants and other wayfarers, market squares where local farmers sold produce, craftsmen's shops offering services from blacksmithing to tailoring, and the general atmosphere of provincial life that continued its rhythms despite the wars and upheavals affecting larger political entities. The rats had visited Jealousy during previous expeditions through the region, finding it suitable for their purposes when they required access to town amenities without the heightened security present in larger administrative centers like Amarillo. The settlement's modest garrison and limited law enforcement presence made it a comfortable destination for outlaws whose faces appeared on wanted posters throughout the province. For authorities in such places typically prioritized avoiding confrontation over zealous pursuit of justice. The local innkeepers and merchants had learned that accommodating the rats meant receiving generous payment from stolen funds, while challenging them invited responses that damaged property and harmed business far more than tolerating their occasional visits. The decision to journey toward Jealousy emerged during one of the gang's planning sessions, moments when Giselher solicited input about their next movements and the group collectively determined destinations and objectives. They had completed a successful raid several days prior, acquiring goods and coins that provided comfortable financial cushion, and the general sentiment favored period of rest and indulgence rather than immediate planning for additional criminal operations. Jealousy offered the advantages of familiar territory combined with entertainment options that their forest camps could not provide. Taverns where they could drink and socialize, vendors selling luxuries they enjoyed purchasing with their ill-gotten wealth. The journey itself proceeded through landscapes entering the deep phase of autumn, forests displaying colors that presaged winter's approach and fields lying fallow after harvest season's conclusion. The rats traveled in loose formation, maintaining awareness of their surroundings without the rigid discipline that characterized military units, their youth and confidence expressing itself through casual conversation and occasional horseplay that made them seem like ordinary young people rather than notorious criminals. Ciri rode beside Mistle as had become their habit, the two sharing observations about the passing scenery or engaging in the private exchanges that characterized their relationship. The other rats distributed themselves according to preference, Giselher and Iskra maintaining position near the group's front, while Kayleigh, Reef, and Asse occupied various positions that shifted as mood and conversation dictated. The false sense of security that enveloped them during this journey reflected their success at evading serious consequences throughout months of criminal activity. Hotspur's warnings about Bonhart had faded into background noise, overtaken by more immediate concerns about where they would stay in Jealousy and which establishments they would patronize during their visit. The possibility that professional violence tracked them with patience and methodology far exceeding anything provincial authorities could deploy remained abstract, failing to translate into concrete modifications of their behavior or heightened vigilance that might have detected surveillance. They had grown accustomed to being hunters rather than hunted, predators who chose their targets and dictated terms of engagement, and this self-conception left them psychologically unprepared for role reversal that approached with each mile they traveled toward Jealousy. The intelligence network that served Bonhart had tracked the rats' movements and identified their probable destination through combination of direct observation and information purchased from contacts within their support system. The gang's patterns had become predictable to those who studied them systematically, their tendency to visit certain towns after successful operations creating probabilities that experienced hunters could exploit. Word of their planned arrival in Jealousy reached Bonhart through channels he had established, providing him sufficient advance notice to position himself advantageously before they entered the town. This represented precisely the sort of convergence he engineered through patient preparation, moment when prey walked willingly into circumstances that heavily favored the hunter. The tip-off that enabled Bonhart's preparation came from source within the network of civilians who maintained relationships with the rats, someone whose loyalty to the gang proved insufficient when confronted with the choice between modest compensation for silence and substantial reward for betrayal. The specific identity of the informant remained obscured within the operational details that Bonhart maintained with professional discretion, though the information provided proved accurate enough to justify whatever payment he had extended. The betrayal represented an inevitable outcome of the rats' reliance on networks built through intimidation and temporary self-interest rather than genuine bonds, for such structures collapsed when sufficient pressure or incentive applied to their weakest points. The rats entered Jealousy during afternoon hours when the town's daily activities proceeded at their ordinary pace, merchants conducting business, children playing in streets under watchful eyes of mothers or older siblings, dogs wandering between buildings in perpetual search for food scraps or attention from friendly humans. Their arrival attracted the usual notice from residents who recognized them or understood from their bearing and appearance that these visitors represented the sort of danger best acknowledged through averted gazes and quick retreats indoors. The gang proceeded through the streets toward the inn they had patronized during previous visits, a substantial establishment called the Chimera's Head that occupied prominent position near the town square. The innkeeper greeted them with the forced cordiality that characterized his interactions with the rats, aware that refusing them service invited more trouble than accommodating their presence. They arranged for rooms and stabling for their horses, conducting these transactions with a casual expectation of compliance that came naturally to those accustomed to having their demands met through reputation alone. The establishment offered common room where food and drink could be consumed in social atmosphere, private chambers for those seeking quieter accommodations, and general amenities that made it suitable headquarters for the sort of extended stay the rats anticipated. The mood among the gang as they settled into the Chimera's Head carried celebratory quality, Relief at reaching destination combined with anticipation of pleasures they planned to pursue during their time in jealousy. They gathered in the common room to share drinks and discuss their immediate intentions, some planning to visit particular shops or vendors, while others expressed contentment with remaining at the inn to enjoy food and entertainment available within its walls. Ciri participated in these discussions with the easy familiarity she had developed during her months as Falka, her integration into the group so complete that she functioned as full member rather than addition whose newness required accommodation. The ordinary quality of the afternoon concealed the extraordinary danger that had positioned itself within the town, for Bonhart had arrived ahead of them and established himself in circumstances that would allow him to dictate when and how confrontation would occur. The rats' false sense of security, their confidence in familiar surroundings and their track record of successful operations, created precisely the psychological vulnerability that made them ideal targets for someone who understood how to exploit such blindness. They drank and laughed and planned their evening's entertainment, unaware that the hunter who had accepted contract for their destruction occupied the same building, waiting with the patience of stone for the moment when all variables aligned to allow him to execute the operation he had so carefully prepared. The inn that bore the name Chimera's Head had served travelers and merchants for generations. Its structure expanded and modified over decades until it formed a complex of interconnected rooms surrounding a central common area where patrons gathered for food, drink, and the social exchanges that made such establishments vital to provincial towns' daily life. The building's architecture reflected practical considerations rather than aesthetic ambition, thick timber beams supporting upper floors where private chambers offered varying degrees of comfort depending on guests' willingness to pay, while the ground level accommodated kitchen facilities, storage areas, and the large open space where the innkeeper conducted most of his business. The establishment had witnessed countless transactions, both legal and questionable, throughout its existence, serving as neutral ground where different elements of society intersected briefly before continuing their separate journeys. Leo Bonhart had arrived in jealousy 2 days before the rats' expected appearance, time he invested in reconnaissance that transformed casual familiarity with the town into tactical understanding of its spaces and possibilities. His initial survey identified the Chimera's Head as probable destination based on intelligence about the gang's previous patterns and their preference for establishments large enough to accommodate their entire group while offering amenities they considered worth the exposure risk of entering populated areas. He secured lodging at the inn under unremarkable pretense, presenting himself as merchant whose business required temporary residence while conducting negotiations with local suppliers. The innkeeper accepted this explanation without curiosity, for asking too many questions about guests' purposes invited complications that prudent hospitality workers avoided. The days preceding the rats' arrival allowed Bonhart to study the Chimera's Head's internal geography with attention to details that would matter during violent confrontation. He noted the positions of exits and how quickly they could be reached from various points within the common room, observed the structural elements that might provide cover or impediment during combat, and identified sightlines that would allow him to monitor approaches while maintaining advantageous position. The common room featured a large central area with tables arranged for dining, a bar along one wall where the innkeeper or his staff served drinks, stairs leading to upper chambers, and doorways providing access to kitchen areas and the street outside. Bonhart selected seating that placed his back to solid wall while offering clear view of the main entrance and the stairs, position that would allow him to observe the rats' arrival and movements without exposing himself to approach from behind. The preparation extended beyond merely understanding physical space to include psychological readiness for engaging multiple opponents simultaneously while maintaining control sufficient to capture one target alive. Bonhart understood that the rats fought as coordinated unit, their months together creating patterns of mutual support that would activate automatically once violence commenced. His strategy required disrupting this coordination through overwhelming initial aggression that would scatter their formation and force them into reactive rather than coordinated responses. The challenge of subduing Ciri without causing damage that would violate his contract's requirements meant he needed to neutralize the protective barrier of her companions before addressing her specifically. The weapons Bonhart carried reflected his professional assessment of requirements rather than theatrical display, practical instruments maintained with the care of someone whose survival depended on equipment reliability. His primary blade represented exceptional craftsmanship, balanced for speed and control. Its edge honed to the sharpness that separated amateur gear from tools wielded by masters of violence. The sword hung in position that allowed rapid draw, muscle memory developed through decades of use, ensuring the motion would occur with reflexive speed when circumstances demanded it. He wore the 3 Witcher medallions openly, the wolf, cat, and griffin symbols hanging from his neck where they would be visible to anyone who looked closely, serving simultaneously as trophy display and psychological weapon for those who understood their significance. The psychological preparation involved entering the mental state that allowed him to execute violence without hesitation or moral interference, the professional detachment that separated successful hunters from those whose inhibitions compromised effectiveness at critical moments. Bonhart had cultivated this capacity throughout his career, developing ability to view targets as objectives rather than persons, reducing complex human beings to the simple binary of contract fulfilled or contract failed. The Rat's youth registered in his assessment only as tactical factor affecting their experience levels and likely responses to pressure, irrelevant to the moral calculus that he had long since abandoned as impediment to professional function. The afternoon when the Rats finally arrived unfolded according to the patterns Bonhart had anticipated through his preparation and intelligence gathering. He observed from his chosen position as they entered the Chimera's head, noting their bearing and the casual confidence that marked them as unaware of immediate danger. They moved through the common room toward the innkeeper to arrange their accommodations, their attention focused on practical matters rather than scanning for threats. Bonhart watched Ciri specifically, confirming that the ashen-haired girl matched descriptions provided in his contract briefing, her presence among the gang validating the intelligence that had brought him to jealousy. The timing of his intended action required waiting until circumstances maximized his advantages while minimizing the Rat's capacity for coordinated response or escape. Engaging them immediately upon arrival, while they remained alert from travel and potentially near their horses in the street outside, would allow too many variables that might compromise the operation's success. Better to wait until they had settled into the false security of the familiar establishment, until they had consumed enough alcohol to slightly dull their reflexes, until the evening's progression created conditions where surprise would paralyze them momentarily during the critical opening seconds when he would establish dominance through overwhelming violence. Bonhart maintained his position through the afternoon and into early evening, a patient presence that drew no attention from the Rats as they moved between their rooms and the common area. He appeared as merely another traveler occupying space in the inn, unremarkable middle-aged man whose lean build and weathered features suggested someone accustomed to roads and commerce rather than the sort of danger he actually represented. The Rats gathered at a large table to share food and drink, their conversation carrying the easy familiarity of those who had spent months in each other's constant company. They discussed plans for their time in jealousy with the relaxed tone of people who believed themselves safe within walls they considered friendly territory. The sun's descent toward the horizon marked the approach of the time Bonhart had selected for initiating the confrontation. The common room had filled with other patrons as evening business commenced, townspeople and travelers seeking food and entertainment after the day's labors concluded. This audience would witness what followed, their presence ensuring that news of the Rat's fate would spread throughout the region with the speed that accompanied dramatic events in provincial settings where such occurrences provided rare excitement. Bonhart felt neither anticipation nor dread as the moment approached, only the cold readiness of someone about to perform familiar work whose execution he had refined across countless previous operations. The trap had been set with patience and care, the prey had entered willingly, and now remained only the spring's release and the violence that would transform the notorious Rats from living threat into concluded chapter in the continent's catalogue of outlaws who discovered that no success lasts forever. The moment of transition from preparation to execution arrived without fanfare or dramatic announcement, Bonhart rising from his position with the deliberate economy of motion that characterized his every action. The common room's ambient noise continued around him as he approached the Rat's table, conversations and laughter from other patrons creating acoustic backdrop that would soon be shattered by sounds of a different nature. His movement drew no particular attention initially, appearing as merely another guest crossing the space for purposes unknown, and the rats remained focused on their own discussions until his proximity and his direct approach toward their gathering finally registered as something requiring assessment. Giselher noticed him first, the gang leader's instincts honed through months of dangerous living recognizing something in the approaching figures bearing that transcended ordinary threat. The grim young man with black hair straightened slightly, his attention shifting from conversation to evaluation of the stranger whose destination clearly terminated at their table. The others followed Giselher's lead, their awareness rippling through the group as they registered the approaching presence, hands moving casually but deliberately toward weapons that they wore even in supposedly safe environments. Ciri felt the tension shift around her, the sudden alertness that transformed the rats from relaxed celebrants to the coordinated unit that had survived numerous confrontations through mutual vigilance and rapid collective response. Bonhart stopped at comfortable speaking distance, close enough that his words would carry clearly to the rats without requiring raised voice that might alert the common room's other occupants prematurely to the violence about to unfold. His expression carried neither hostility nor friendliness, maintaining the professional neutrality of someone conducting business transaction rather than personal vendetta. He spoke with clarity that cut through the ambient noise, offering them choice framed in terms that allowed no real negotiation. They could surrender themselves to his custody, accepting capture without resistance, or they could refuse and face consequences that his tone suggested would be final and absolute. The presentation of options constituted formality rather than genuine offering of mercy, for Bonhart understood these particular young people well enough to predict their response before speaking. The rat's rejection of his terms emerged through Giselher's response, words that carried contempt for the suggestion that they would submit to anyone's authority after months of living according to principles that explicitly repudiated such submission. The gang leader's refusal spoke for them collectively, expressing the philosophy that had bound them together and sustained them through their existence as outlaws. They would fight rather than surrender, would face whatever this stranger represented rather than betray the core commitment that anyone alone must perish, but together they remained strong. The response satisfied Bonhart's expectations, confirming tactical assessments that had shaped his preparation, and he moved with the sudden explosive speed that separated professional violence from common brutality. The draw and strike occurred in motion so swift that witnesses later struggled to describe the sequence accurately, muscle memory and supernatural reflex combining to produce attack that defied normal human reaction times. Asse, whose broad shoulders and youth suggested strength he had not yet learned to deploy effectively against truly skilled opponents, died in the opening seconds before his hand completed its reach toward his weapon. The blade that ended him penetrated with surgical precision, finding vital points that ensured rapid cessation of function, and the young blacksmith's son from Thurn who had saved Mistle from a ditch collapsed across the table before his companions fully processed that violence had commenced. The wine cups scattered and the wooden surface stained crimson as Asse's body settled into the stillness that would define his existence henceforth. Reef attempted response even as his friend fell, the tall Nilfgaardian's military training activating despite the shock of witnessing Asse's sudden demise. He managed to clear his weapon from its sheath, achieving draw that under other circumstances might have allowed him to mount defense or even counterattack, but Bonhart's speed exceeded anything the young deserter had encountered during his service with the Empire's armies. The bounty hunter's blade redirected from Asse's fallen form to engage Reef with fluid transition that demonstrated complete control over his weapon and his body's positioning. The exchanges lasted mere seconds, a brief sequence of strikes and parries that established the fundamental mismatch between youthful potential and mature mastery. Reef's defense collapsed under pressure that gave him no opportunity to establish rhythm or create space for the sort of coordinated gang response that had carried the rats through previous confrontations. Bonhart's assault drove him backward, separating him from his companion's support, exploiting openings faster than the young man could recognize they had appeared. The final strike came as Reef attempted desperate lunge meant to create distance or opportunity, commitment that left him exposed to counter that Bonhart executed with the same clinical precision that had ended Asse. The tall Nilfgaardian joined his broad-shouldered companion in the permanent absence that awaited all mortals, his body falling in posture that suggested he had died still attempting to fight rather than accepting the inevitable outcome that Bonhart had determined before the engagement commenced. The common room erupted into chaos as other patrons recognized that the violence at the rats' table represented serious combat rather than drunken scuffle, witnesses scrambling toward exits or pressing themselves against walls in instinctive attempts to maximize distance from the danger. The innkeeper's protests died before articulation as he assessed the situation and concluded that intervention would accomplish nothing beyond adding his own demise to the evening's tally. The rats who remained alive attempted to process the reality that 2 of their number had been ended in the time required for drawing breath, their confidence and their philosophy of collective strength confronting practical demonstration that sometimes individual skill exceeded what coordination could overcome. Giselher moved to engage Bonhart from one angle while Kayleigh attempted approach from another, the 2 young men deploying the sort of coordinated assault that had served them well in previous fights. They represented the gang's leadership and its most malevolent member respectively. Their combined assault meant to overwhelm through simultaneous pressure from multiple vectors. Bonhart absorbed their coordination without apparent difficulty, his positioning and movement creating situations where he faced them sequentially despite their attempts at simultaneous engagement. The Witcher-level combat skills that his reputation claimed became evident in these moments, reflexes, and spatial awareness that allowed him to track multiple opponents while maintaining offensive pressure that prevented them from establishing the rhythm necessary for effective teamwork. Iskra attempted intervention from Bonhart's blind side, her elvish speed and the dancer's grace that characterized her movement creating approach that might have succeeded against lesser opponents. She wielded her blade with the quickness that had allowed her to survive as half-elf in hostile territories, her narrow lips compressed with concentration and her big eyes tracking her target with predator's focus. Bonhart detected her approach through combination of peripheral awareness and combat sense developed across decades of facing multiple simultaneous threats. His response involved minimal adjustment to his engagement with Giselher and Kayleigh, slight shift in positioning that created opening for counterattack against Iskra while maintaining defense against the other 2. Ciri and Mistle watched the coordinated assault fail, witnessing their companions' inability to overcome the single opponent whose skills exceeded anything their experience had prepared them to face. Mistle's hand found Ciri's arm, gripped tight with a sort of fear that months of successful banditry had allowed them to forget, recognition that they faced something fundamentally different from the provincial guards and merchant escorts they had previously fought. Ciri felt her Witcher training attempting to assert itself, instincts cultivated at Kaer Morhen suggesting responses and counters that her time as Falka had suppressed, but the shock of watching Asse and Reef fall had created paralysis that prevented her from translating knowledge into action. The common room that minutes earlier had represented safety and familiar territory had transformed into abattoir where the rats' philosophy confronted its limitations and their collective strength demonstrated insufficiency against mastery that operated on a different level entirely. The engagement continued with Bonhart maintaining control over its tempo and geography, his positioning within the common room creating conditions where the surviving rats could not effectively coordinate their remaining numerical advantage. Giselher attempted to reorganize his scattered companions, calling out instructions meant to restore the unity that had served them through previous confrontations, but Bonhart's relentless pressure prevented them from establishing the formation necessary for implementing any coherent tactical response. The gang leader's grim expression had shifted from confidence to recognition that they faced an opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything their experience encompassed, though his commitment to fighting rather than surrendering remained absolute even as circumstances demonstrated the futility of resistance. Bonhart engaged this commitment with words calculated to amplify psychological pressure beyond the physical threat he already represented. He spoke during brief intervals between exchanges, observations delivered in conversational tone that contrasted grotesquely with the violence surrounding them. He mentioned a Witcher named Breen, describing the hunt that had led to that particular medallion's acquisition, providing details meant to establish that his claimed victories over the mutant warriors represented verified history rather than fabricated reputation. The name meant nothing to the rats, for they had never encountered witches directly and understood them only through the general knowledge that circulated throughout the continent's population, but the specificity of Bonhart's account suggested truth rather than bluster. Kayleigh's hatred, which had sustained him through the traumas that preceded his life with the rats, found fresh focus in Bonhart's taunting. The thin young man with long hair and malevolent eyes threw himself into attack with a sort of reckless commitment that emerged when fury overwhelmed tactical judgment. His blade work carried intensity born from accumulated rage against world that had betrayed him repeatedly, starting with his own parents and extending through every subsequent interaction with society's institutions. This emotional fuel provided motivation without conferring skill sufficient to threaten someone of Bonhart's caliber, creating a situation where Kayleigh's aggression served primarily to create openings that the bounty hunter exploited with methodical efficiency. The exchange between them concluded with Kayleigh's hateful grimace frozen in expression that would accompany him into whatever waited beyond mortal existence. Bonhart's strike came as counter to overextended attack, the sort of fundamental error that experienced fighters avoided but that rage-blinded combatants committed with fatal regularity. The malevolent eyes that had frightened even fellow rats dimmed as Kayleigh joined Asse and Reef in the growing collection of bodies that marked Bonhart's systematic destruction of the gang. 3 of the original 6 had now been eliminated, their philosophy about collective strength proving insufficient against individual mastery that operated according to principles they had never understood. Giselher recognized that continued direct engagement would simply add his demise to the tally without achieving any meaningful result. The lanky gang leader with black hair attempted to create space, repositioning to where he might coordinate with Iskra in approach that used the common room's remaining furniture and structural elements as obstacles complicating Bonhart's ability to maintain his dominant positioning. This tactical adjustment represented sound judgment applied too late against opponent who had anticipated such responses during his preparation phase. Bonhart moved to cut off the repositioning, his blade work driving Giselher back toward corner where options for further retreat would disappear. Iskra attempted to exploit Bonhart's focus on Giselher, the half-elf's colorful clothing and lithe movements marking her approach as she sought angle that would allow her to strike while the bounty hunter engaged her partner. Her narrow lips and small elven teeth became visible as she committed to the attack, launching strike meant to end the threat that had already claimed half her chosen family. Bonhart's awareness encompassed her movement despite his apparent concentration on Giselher, that supernatural combat sense again manifesting as he adjusted his engagement to address both threats simultaneously. The counter came as Iskra reached the optimal distance for her attack, Bonhart's blade redirecting from Giselher to meet her approach with precision that suggested he had tracked her positioning throughout. The strike that ended Iskra carried particular cruelty in its execution, for Bonhart chose method that ensured suffering rather than the relatively quick conclusions he had provided to some of her companions. The wound inflicted would prove mortal given time, but time measured in agonizing moments rather than immediate cessation. She fell away from the engagement, her dancer's grace failing as injury disrupted the physical control that had defined her movement throughout her life. Giselher's anguished cry at witnessing his partner struck down revealed the depth of bond between them, the genuine love that had existed amid the violence and criminality that characterized the rat's existence. The psychological warfare Bonhart conducted through his actions demonstrated understanding that destroying hope constituted weapon as effective as his blade. He had observed the relationships binding the rats together during his preparation phase, noting which members showed particular attachment to specific others. The systematic targeting of these bonds served dual purpose of eliminating threats while inflicting maximum emotional damage on survivors who witnessed their companions fall. Giselher's distraction following Iskra's injury created opening that Bonhart exploited immediately, capitalizing on the moment when the gang leader's attention divided between his wounded partner and the opponent who had engineered this division. The strike that ended Giselher came while the young man attempted to reach Iskra, his tactical discipline finally collapsing under emotional weight of watching her suffer. Bonhart's blade found him during this lapse, delivering conclusion that terminated both the gang leader's life and the rat's organizational coherence. The grim figure who had formed the gang after surviving the massacre of his previous criminal band, who had been freed from an elven arrow by Iskra's mercy, who had led the rats through months of successful operations, settled beside his partner in the stillness that would unite them permanently. Their joining in this final state represented the only mercy present in the common room that evening, the chance to occupy adjacent spaces as they transitioned from notorious outlaws to mere bodies awaiting disposal. Ciri and Mistle remained, the only survivors of the original 7 who had gathered at tables in this very establishment hours earlier to celebrate their continued success. The swiftness of the rats' destruction had created psychological shock that paralyzed effective response, their months of confidence and collective strength demolished in time span measured in minutes. The common room's floor bore witness to the violence through spreading pools and scattered furniture, while the witnesses who remained pressed against walls existed in their own states of shock, civilians who had come seeking ordinary evening's entertainment and instead received education about the fragility of young lives lived outside society's protections. Bonhart turned his attention to the 2 remaining rats, his assessment calculating which represented the ashen-haired girl specified in his contract and which constituted additional target requiring elimination before he could safely pursue the primary objective. Mistle positioned herself between Bonhart and Ciri with instinctive protectiveness that overrode rational assessment of her chances against opponent, who had just systematically destroyed 5 capable fighters. Her cropped straw-colored hair and long-legged frame stood as barrier between the bounty hunter and the girl she had claimed months earlier during that first night in a barn outside Amarillo. The bond forged through complicated circumstances of trauma and possession manifested as willingness to die defending Ciri, final expression of whatever love or ownership or desperate connection had existed between them. The common room of the Chimera's head had been transformed into space that bore witness to the totality of professional violence applied against youthful confidence. 5 bodies lay in positions determined by the final moments of their resistance. The rats who had ridden together and fought together now united only in their shared cessation. The witnesses pressed against walls maintained their frozen observation. Civilians whose evening had provided education about the distance between reputation and reality, between the stories told about notorious outlaws and the actual vulnerability of young lives confronting true mastery of lethal craft. The innkeeper had abandoned any pretense of maintaining order, his concern focused entirely on survival through non-intervention, recognition that whatever unfolded between Bonhart and the remaining rats existed beyond his capacity to influence. Mistle stood between the bounty hunter and Ciri with stance that communicated absolute commitment despite the evidence scattered across the floor regarding the futility of such positioning. Her tall frame and long legs created physical barrier that represented more symbol than genuine obstacle, for Bonhart had demonstrated repeatedly during the preceding minutes that individual courage and defensive positioning meant little against his combination of speed, skill, and tactical intelligence. The cropped straw-colored hair that marked her rejection of conventional femininity now framed face that carried expression mixing defiance with understanding that she faced her final moments, that the bond she had formed with Ciri would conclude here in this blood-marked space. Bonhart assessed the configuration with a calculating attention he devoted to all tactical situations, recognizing that Mistle's protective positioning served his purposes by keeping Ciri stationary rather than attempting flight that would complicate his primary objective of capturing her alive. He could afford patience in addressing this final barrier, for the common room's exits had been effectively sealed by his control over the space and no reinforcements approached that might shift the engagement's balance. The tall girl with the brush-like hair represented final obstacle between him and contract fulfillment, target whose elimination would clear path to the valuable prize whose capture would justify the considerable effort invested in engineering this convergence. Mistle engaged him first, choosing offense over the futile defense her positioning suggested. She moved with the speed and determination of someone who understood that passivity meant certain defeat while attack offered at least possibility of unexpected outcome, however remote probability suggested such hopes might be. Her blade work demonstrated competence acquired through her time with the rats, months of raids and robberies that had provided practical education in violence even if they had never prepared her for opponent of Bonhart's caliber. The initial exchanges established the pattern that had repeated throughout the evening, youthful skill and courage confronting mature mastery and discovering that gap between them exceeded what determination could bridge. The engagement proceeded through sequence of strikes and counters, missile pressing attacks meant to create openings or force errors while Bonhart responded with economy of motion that wasted no energy on unnecessary flourishes. She attempted feints and combinations learned through observation of more experienced fighters, techniques that had served her adequately during the rats' operations against ordinary opposition. Bonhart read these attempts with the ease of someone who had faced every variation of sword work that human practitioners employed, his decades of experience creating a database of patterns that allowed him to anticipate and counter before attacks fully developed. The moment of opportunity Mistle sought emerged briefly as Bonhart adjusted his positioning to account for Ciri's location behind her partner. Slight shift that created opening that appeared exploitable to someone desperate enough to risk everything on single committed strike. Mistle recognized the possibility and launched attack meant to capitalize on what seemed like vulnerability, her blade driving toward target with full extension that represented abandonment of defensive positioning in favor of attempting decisive blow. The opening had been deliberately created, trap designed to elicit exactly the sort of committed attack that would leave the attacker exposed to counter she could neither avoid nor survive. Bonhart's response came with speed that defied normal human reflexes, that supernatural quickness which characterized his most dangerous capabilities. The counter found Mistle during her extended commitment, blade entering her body with precision that reflected anatomical knowledge combined with decades of practice in ending human function efficiently. The strike proved mortal immediately, though biological processes required moments to complete the transition from living to ended, seconds during which consciousness persisted even as body betrayed its inhabitant through failure of systems necessary for continuation. The cruelty Bonhart demonstrated in these final moments exceeded tactical necessity, entering territory of deliberate infliction of psychological trauma designed specifically for Ciri's witness. He withdrew his blade from Mistle's body with deliberation that extended her suffering, allowing her to experience full awareness of her condition before delivering the conclusive violence that would follow. The tall girl who had survived assault in her past, who had been found half expired in a ditch by Asse, who had claimed Ciri during that first complicated night in a barn, who had worn matching tattoos as symbol of bond neither fully understood, fell to her knees as her body systems began cascading failure. Ciri's paralysis broke as she witnessed Mistle's injury, her voice finding expression through scream that carried anguish accumulated through every loss and trauma of her young life. She attempted to reach her partner, to provide comfort or intervention or simply presence during these final moments, but Bonhart positioned himself to prevent such access. His actions served dual purpose of maintaining control over Ciri's position while ensuring maximum psychological impact from the violence he would complete before her helpless observation. The methodology reflected understanding that breaking someone's will sometimes require forcing them to witness their powerlessness to prevent harm to those they valued. The final act of violence against Mistle involved her severed head, brutality that exceeded any requirement of his contract or tactical situation. Bonhart executed this desecration with the same clinical efficiency he had demonstrated throughout the evening, treating Mistle's body as object rather than person, reducing the girl who had danced with elvish grace and fought with desperate courage to mere trophy whose condition served purpose of terrorizing the witness he intended to capture. The narrow lips and small elven teeth that had characterized her appearance became elements of severed head that Bonhart handled as evidence of his thoroughness in completing the contract's elimination requirements. Ciri's psychological response to witnessing this desecration involved shattering of whatever internal structures had sustained her through months as Falka, dissolution of the protective persona she had constructed to survive captivity and trauma. The girl who had embraced violence as first impulse, who had threatened children and stepped over remains to acquire cotton candy, who had descended into darkness through association with the rats, confronted in these moments the ultimate consequence of existence lived outside all protections. The rats' philosophy that anyone alone must perish had proven accurate, though not in the manner they had understood when articulating their collective commitment. Their togetherness had been demolished by individual whose skills rendered their numerical advantage meaningless, and now only Ciri remained, alone in the most absolute sense that word encompassed. Bonhart approached her with Mistle's severed head in hand, the trophy serving as instrument of psychological dominance as he prepared to transition from elimination of obstacles to capture of primary target. Ciri attempted response, her Witcher training finally accessing through shock and trauma, hands reaching for weapons even as her mind struggled to process the totality of what had unfolded during these minutes that had destroyed everything the rats represented. The attempt came too late and from position too compromised to offer genuine threat to someone of Bonhart's capabilities. Desperate gesture of someone whose world had collapsed and who grasped at any action that might restore sense of agency or control. The common room's remaining witnesses observed as Bonhart subdued Ciri with efficiency that suggested he had planned this specific sequence, methods for controlling her without inflicting damage that would reduce her value to those who had commissioned her capture. She fought against his restraint with fury born from accumulated losses, attempting to employ techniques learned at Kayleigh against opponent whose experience exceeded even the witches who had trained her. The struggle concluded with Ciri restrained and helpless, the ashen-haired girl who had been princess and refugee and student, and Falka now reduced a captive whose fate would be determined by forces beyond her capacity to influence. The business that followed the violence proceeded with methodical attention to details that transformed immediate carnage into evidence suitable for contract verification and compensation collection. Bonhart moved through the common room addressing practical requirements that his profession demanded, treatment of remains that reflected neither respect nor cruelty but simple acknowledgement that proof of elimination represented necessary component of bounty work. The collection he assembled included portions of the rats that would serve as verification for those who had commissioned their destruction, physical evidence that the notorious gang no longer operated as threat to Nilfgaardian interests in Geso province. The heads of the 6 original members joined Mistles in the grim inventory that Bonhart prepared for transport, trophies whose significance extended beyond mere proof to encompass psychological warfare against others who might consider similar paths. Ciri remained restrained throughout this process, forced to witness the systematic collection of her companions' remains while unable to intervene or escape. The bonds Bonhart employed reflected professional understanding of how to secure captives whose training made them dangerous even when apparently helpless, positioning and materials chosen to prevent the sort of sudden reversals that less experienced captors might allow through insufficient precaution. She existed in state beyond tears or protest, psychological shock having progressed to numbness that represented mind's protective shutdown when trauma exceeded processing capacity. The Falka identity that had sustained her through months with the rats dissolved under weight of witnessing their total destruction, leaving vacancy where persona had existed, absence of self that made her compliant through sheer inability to formulate coherent response to circumstances. The witnesses who had observed the massacre from their positions pressed against walls began departing once Bonhart indicated through gesture and tone that their presence no longer concerned him. They fled the chimera's head with the urgency of those who had survived proximity to extreme violence and wished to maximize distance before circumstances changed. Civilians whose evening had provided stories they would tell for remainder of their lives about the night the rats met their end in Jealousy's most prominent inn. The innkeeper remained, his establishment transformed into scene whose cleaning would require days and whose reputation would carry the stain of this evening's events indefinitely, though he recognized that the notoriety might paradoxically increase business from those drawn to locations where dramatic history had unfolded. Bonhart's departure from Jealousy occurred during the hours before dawn, darkness providing cover for transport of his prisoner and his collected evidence through streets where few witnesses moved to observe or question his activities. Ciri rode secured to horse whose reins Bonhart controlled, her positioning preventing escape while allowing the travel pace his schedule required. The town receded behind them as they entered countryside where autumn's progression toward winter manifested in morning frost that covered fields and forests, natural beauty that contrasted grotesquely with the human violence that had preceded this journey. The route Bonhart selected avoided major roads in favor of paths that reduced probability of encounters with patrols or bandits who might complicate his mission's completion. The delivery of Ciri to Stefan Skellen occurred at location determined through prior arrangement between the bounty hunter and his employer, meeting point chosen for discretion rather than comfort or convenience. Skellen's presence brought additional agents whose purpose involved securing the prisoner for transport to wherever the Tawny Owl intended to conduct his interrogations and implement his schemes regarding the true princess of Cintra. The exchange of captive for compensation proceeded with businesslike efficiency, Bonhart receiving payment that compensated for months of preparation and the execution of operation that had eliminated 7 dangerous outlaws while capturing the specific target alive as contracted. The transaction concluded relationships between hunter and employer, each party satisfied that terms had been met and obligations fulfilled. Ciri's captivity under Skellen's control would extend through period whose duration and conditions existed beyond the rat story. her journey continuing into territories of exploitation and suffering that dwarfed even what she had experienced during her time as Falka. The psychological damage inflicted through witnessing the rat's destruction, and particularly Mistle's desecration, would persist long after physical restraints were eventually removed or escaped. Trauma that would shape the woman she would become and influence decisions she would make throughout her remaining life. The months spent with the gang had represented descent into darkness, but the manner of their ending provided education about depths that exceeded what she had previously comprehended, demonstration that her embrace of violence as Falka had been amateur performance compared to what true professionals accomplished when they applied their craft. The rat's legacy scattered across multiple dimensions following their elimination in jealousy. The wanted posters that had featured their faces gradually disappeared from public spaces, replaced by notices regarding other outlaws who filled the void their absence created in the province's criminal ecology. The civilians who had benefited from their redistribution of stolen goods mourned them with a sort of selective memory that transformed complicated reality into simplified narrative of young rebels who had challenged unjust authority. The truth that the rats had pursued their own satisfaction rather than political resistance, that they had inflicted trauma on innocent victims including children, that their philosophy of contempt had produced as much cruelty as courage, became obscured through the romanticization that often followed violent deaths of young people. The physical locations where the rats had operated retained traces of their presence for varying durations after their destruction. The barn outside Amarillo where Ciri and Mistle had spent their first complicated night together remained standing, sheltering other travelers or animals without awareness of what had transpired within its walls. The forest clearings where they had made camps returned to their natural states, evidence of human occupation fading as seasons progressed and new growth obscured the marks of their fires and their temporary dwellings. The Chimera's head in jealousy underwent cleaning and repairs that addressed physical damage while leaving psychological residue that would affect the establishment's atmosphere indefinitely, patrons sensing something in the space even when they lacked knowledge of specific history that had unfolded there. The individuals whose lives had intersected with the rats carried forward their own forms of the gang's legacy. Hotspur learned of their fate through networks that transmitted such information among those who operated at society's margins, his warnings having proven accurate though arriving too late or being dismissed too readily to alter outcomes. The Baron of Casadia's daughter grew into a young woman whose nightmares never fully released her from the night when an ashen-haired girl had shown her what cruelty could accomplish through words alone. The vendors and merchants who had dealt with the rats found new criminal contacts to replace the relationships that had provided them access to stolen goods at favorable prices. The philosophical question implicit in the rats' existence and destruction concerned whether their story represented tragedy or inevitable consequence, whether they deserved sympathy as victims of circumstances beyond their control or condemnation for choices they made despite alternatives. They had survived abandonment, betrayal, violence, and war's destruction of the world they had known as children, circumstances that might justify their turn toward criminality and their embrace of philosophy that rejected society's moral frameworks. They had also chosen to inflict suffering on others, to celebrate cruelty, to make violence their first response rather than last resort, decisions that individual trauma might explain without excusing. The ambiguity resisted simple resolution, leaving their memory contested between those who viewed them as tragic victims and those who recognized them as perpetrators whose ending represented justice however brutal its delivery. Ciri's relationship to the rat's memory would evolve across years following her captivity's eventual conclusion, her understanding of what they had represented and what her time among them had meant shifting as she gained distance and perspective. The tattoos marking her skin would remain as permanent record of choices made during her descent, physical evidence that she had belonged to the gang and participated in their activities. The psychological scars would prove more persistent than the ink, manifesting in ways that affected her capacity for trust, her responses to authority, her understanding of violence and its place in human interaction. The rats had provided belonging during period when she possessed nothing else, offering acceptance that came with costs she had been too broken to properly assess at the time. The story of the rats concluded in the common room of the Chimera's head. 6 young lives ended and a 7th captured. Their collective existence as gang terminated after months of operation that had made them notorious across territories where most criminal enterprises remained anonymous. They had believed their philosophy about collective strength would sustain them against any threat. Confidence born from success against ordinary opposition and youth's natural tendency toward feeling invincible. The encounter with Bonhart had demonstrated the limitations of their understanding, revealing that some threats operated at levels where numbers and courage meant little against mastery refined through decades of professional violence. The rats perished not because they lacked skill or determination, but because they confronted reality that exceeded the frameworks their limited experience had prepared them to comprehend, lesson learned too late to inform different choices that might have produced alternative outcomes.